4 council members. Almost. We only have 4 for the next while. So this is a quorum and we're going to start our meeting. Thank you for being with us. It's a lively but small crowd. We're going to start with our first work session item, the Informational Economic Development Strategic Plan. Allison Rowland from Council Office staff, Laura Fritz, our Director of Economic Development.
No, I would screw that.
Ben and Danny, please join us. Pull those mics up. And Allison, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'll just let you know that this is an informational briefing for the Economic Development Strategic Plan that the Department of Economic Development has put together. It was something that the strategic plan was something that the council was interested in, and that the council indicated as part of as one of its priorities during the time it was doing its economic development priority for several years. So this is it. And we have, well, I'll let members of the administration introduce themselves.
Thank you. Take it away, Director Fritz.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Fritz, the Director of the Department of Economic Development, and very happy to be here with you. And thank you, Council Chairman Mendenhall, for having us. Looking forward to sharing with you our Economic Development Strategic Plan.
Ben Collender, Deputy Director. I think you all know me.
Danny Waltz, Chief Operating Officer of the Redevelopment Agency.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we really appreciate you guys setting aside some time to hear about what we've put together. We know you guys have some busy schedules. So the team really put a lot of effort into this strategic plan. And so we're going to walk you through a little bit of what we did to put this together, as well as some of the things that came out on the other side. One of the things that we want to recognize first is that some previous work had been done on a strategic plan, or at least some elements of a strategic plan with the Enterprise SLC plan. So one of our first things that we started out doing with this plan was to recognize that, go through the work that had been done previously and align that with what we were doing. And what we found was most of the stuff had been addressed over the past year in the creation of the department. And so we recognized that there was a new, we would be looking at a lot of new initiatives compared to what had been done previously. So one of the things out of the gate when the department was created, we wanted to spend a lot of time listening to the community. So we didn't want to come in with this is what we think is a good idea and just start implementing. So we wanted to do basically a listening phase of our department where we really got out into the community, and we spent 242 site visits in our first year. And we also did a survey from EDCU. They partnered with us to do a quantitative survey where we went out and asked the business community, what do you guys think? What are your largest barriers to growth? And really got some great feedback from that. And as well, we did 100 visits specifically to follow up on the quantitative survey that we did to get a more in-depth understanding of what the challenges for businesses were. So we did a lot of work before we even started putting pen to paper on this strategic plan to just understand what's the atmosphere out there. What does the community say we should be focusing on? What are they thinking? What are their challenges? Where do they see opportunity? So we just also provided a slide for awareness on some of the stakeholders we engaged. And another part, after we did our real listening phase, after we started the process for the strategic plan, we did a lot of roundtables that were sector focused. So either workforce development, international focus as well. And so we did 10 roundtables with the community. And these are some of the names that we hosted roundtables with. So just for reference as well, in the department, we have the 3 divisions which you're all familiar with, the RDA, the Arts Council, and the Business Development Team. And each one of us has different clients that we focus on. With the Business Development Team, we focus primarily on businesses. So those could be local businesses, they could be out-of-market businesses, and really asking the question on how do we serve those businesses. With the RDA, mainly the main focus is developers. And the Arts Council is a creatives community. And this is all really tied back into how do we benefit the city as a whole, but these are our primary clients. And when we were all collaborating on, we received a lot of feedback. We know what the vision is for the city in large part, but we wanted to communicate this into a vision for the department. And so that's illustrated there on your right. We build Salt Lake City as a vibrant, beautiful, prosperous, and diverse, authentic place. We do this through, as a professional organization, through partnerships, business development, arts and culture, placemaking, revitalization, and redevelopment, while promoting the city's many attributes. So out of our session, we really got, to summarize the 4 strategic goals that we had as outputs, we want to be competitive and grow sustainably, first and foremost. We also want to cultivate vibrancy, and we have some great tools with the RDA and the Arts Council to do that. We want to be leaders in economic development for the community, and in the past, this was a gap that Salt Lake City had. And we also want to be put on the map globally. So not just thinking, what can we do on a small scale, but to really think outside of that and realize the opportunity for Salt Lake City. And I'll get into more of the details on those 4 goals shortly. But one important thing to note on this is when we, a lot of investment goes into strategic plans, and a lot of the question is, great, you've done a plan, now what are you going to do? And so we've built in a framework into how we operate as a department to say, okay, we have these 4 goals that we're going to try and do. How do we do it? Well, every year we have a work planning session where we get the team together and think about the big picture things we need to accomplish for the next year and how it aligns with our goals. And when we do our work planning, the work plan itself is structured the same way as our strategic plan. So big 4 objectives, and then that rolls back into secondary objectives and priorities for the department to focus on. And the work plan is structured just in that. So when we come up with these things and fill them in, we also see, we kind of have a gap in this priority that we've set as a department. How should we be considering, taking that on or making sure that we're doing that work?
This also helps us with understanding the staffing needs as well as the budget priorities. And I think we sent a copy of the work plan for this past fiscal year, this current fiscal year that we're in, for you just to review.
Yes, we got a copy of that put into your red folders, council members, in case you're looking for a hard copy, and it will be online as soon as we can get it there.
So, after we develop our work plan, like Laura just mentioned, we've shared our work plan that we've been working on this year so far, but some of the big accomplishments and how that really rolls out into the goals. Goal 1, position Salt Lake City to compete against like cities and capturing opportunities for all residents. Some of the things that we've done this year as a department, just to highlight that, the Framing Assistant pilot program that we've worked to help employ some of the people who were homeless. Another example, just as a case study, in recruiting in Amazon, which has a low barrier of entry for jobs, but they're well-paying jobs, comparatively speaking, for the barrier to entry it takes to get in there. We had a constituent write us and talk about her experience in us recruiting Amazon. Her husband's employer actually raised his salary by $2 an hour because of the recruitment of Amazon. So that's how some of the work that we're doing is impacting the community. And just some of the numbers as well in terms of our FY16-17 numbers. We recruited over. Our recruitment supported the recruitment of 6,000 plus jobs, and those jobs were well-paying jobs. The salaries were over $66,000 each, and the total impact of those jobs, including indirect and induced, was over $482 million. So goal 2, which is cultivate vibrancy throughout Salt Lake City by enhancing the arts, commercial districts, and housing opportunities. Some of the things that we've worked on this year, which impact this goal, is so the public-private partnership with Twilight that's been done, or the private-private partnership, I should say, but the city had a role in helping to orchestrate that. Also, the Main Street America program, which you guys I believe are familiar with, and we also have a plan to do a lot more work in this realm as our workforce development position comes on board here in March. So, goal 3, which is secure Salt Lake City as a global, vital, and innovative community. Some of the work that we've done that highlights that this year is the foreign trade zone. So this is an initiative that's been a bit stagnant in the city for almost 10 years since the Department of Commerce updated the framework. So this was a huge win for the city as we transition into the new framework for the foreign trade zone, which is going to create a lot of opportunity for the residents here in terms of jobs and capital investment into the city. We've also been, with our marketing manager, Annie Davis. She's been fantastic at the work that she's done in highlighting the department. We have a weekly ABC4 segment, which we get up at 6 a.m. every Thursday. Somebody from the department is up there talking about the great work that we're doing. So, and then just some of the big wins, such as Amazon and Stadler, that really put Salt Lake City on the map for the economy here and how lucrative it can be for businesses outside of the market. So, and finally, goal 4 is position the department as the authority on economic development opportunities in Salt Lake City. Some of the things that have been done this year to highlight that are the progress on the Northwest Quadrant, as well as our outreach into the community, some of the site visits that we've done to make businesses aware that we exist as a department and we have services and products that can help them. And also, we're working on enhancing our collaboration between the divisions. And as we go on as a department, that's only going to get stronger. And we've already been finding some innovative ideas, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in the near future that can help support that. So, and finally, just looking forward, I mean, we're working as a department right now in our rhythm as the budget's coming up at our FY19 work plan. And, framing again through the same process, walking backwards through the strategic plan and our work plan, filling in those items. So we're in that process now. And one of the things that we've identified is, we do have limited resources, but we're comfortable with the amount of resources we have at this point. At least I can speak for the business development and art side. I know you're understaffed at the moment, but that's nothing to do with what the staffing documents say, right? So, but we've realized that we need to prioritize those goals which overlap the actions in our work plan which overlap the most with the goals and make the biggest impact for the community. So I know the question's been raised about resources, and that's the way that we do it, is to say, well, we need to focus on the biggest and best returns for the city for our staff. And just another thing, we're not necessarily focused on growing staff moving forward, but we may have some program recommendations. We have a budget process we're about to kick off, and we want to consult with the mayor and get her input into that. But that's mainly our focus as a department, is talking more programmatic than on the staffing side for future requests. And just another thing is, as well, we created a dashboard with metrics on it, and it had a slideshow presentation that we had put together. But really, the way that we're going to be looking at presenting these metrics is less static and more fluid. So on our website, when that's launched in March, we hope to have some data stories that highlight that information and bring it to life. Not only what the current state of the city is, but how it's progressed since we've been created. So, yeah, and I think that's about it. Unless you had anything else to add, Danny or Laura?
No, we're excited to keep working on these with business development and the arts. And
All right, thank you. Council members, do you have questions? Comments? There's only 4 of us, so we really got to, beef up the conversation here. Double down. Councilmember Wharton.
Thank you. On goal 3, can you talk to me a little bit more about rebrand Salt Lake based on its strengths? What are some action items like under that?
You want to take that? Should I take that one?
We can rock, paper, scissors for it.
So one of the things with Salt Lake City is, and Laura and I just recently had this discussion, is, sometimes there's an effort to rebrand Salt Lake City as something it's not. We have a community here and a population that sometimes we try to pretend doesn't exist, and we market to different areas. But being authentic and marketing to some of the strengths that we have, because of the Mormon community, for example, we're a very international city compared to similar sized cities in other markets, and really branding ourselves as that and focusing on those strengths are some of the focuses that we're doing. So one of the examples that is strategic in that is the foreign trade zone, right? We have so many great international connections, and that's a huge value add, marketing that to some of the companies that exist here that are international because of those connections. But in other examples like that as well, we should be looking at branding ourselves, doing products that sort of align with how the city is and where its strengths are.
And we also want to make sure, oh, I'm sorry.
Can I make a comment on that one? When the Amazon bids were happening all over the country and the Pittsburgh pitch video went viral. Okay, it went viral among council members. I'm not sure if all of you watched it either. Did you see that video that they did about their economy? It's okay, I'm sending it to you, but it is, it doesn't say Amazon, it doesn't say anything like that, but it's part of their, it was, I understand, created around that momentum, but it's used, it can be used in any way. But it's a beautiful tribute to the city and what they've overcome and who they are today and what their values and priorities are. And it left me wanting for that kind of a morsel of this is who Salt Lake City is. This is who our people are. This is where we came from. This is where we want to go. This is what our values are. It sounds not like a council item, except that you might want money someday to do something like that, but I'll send you a video.
Yeah, that would be great.
Talk about branding. It was beautiful.
Great. We're always welcoming of great examples of what's out there.
And we also know that our marketing budget is fairly modest, so to fully rebrand is difficult. But this is where our partnerships can be very meaningful. So we've been partnering with Visit Salt Lake, for example, on their branding program. And ideally, if we can all utilize the same brand and the same messaging, we can maximize our limited resources in a much more meaningful and impactful way.
Keep on.
Oh, okay. Under Goal 2, you have utilize the arts as a means to support economic development, which is something I'm really interested in. Can you flesh that out a little bit more?
I can take that one. We actually, so when we did our quantitative survey, we had over 800 businesses respond on, what are your biggest barriers to growth and what keeps you in Salt Lake City as opposed to expanding in a place like Denver. And this was actually one of the more insightful and surprising things that we got back from the survey. But the number one thing businesses consider, whether they stay here in Salt Lake City or they go somewhere else or expand somewhere else, is the arts and entertainment culture here. And so this has really informed us on the strategic importance of having the Arts Council within the department, and has made for some interesting, like for example, engaging the private sector with Twilight a little bit more makes a lot more sense to keep that going the way it is, and enhancing the arts in the city makes a lot of sense economically as well. So we bake that into our work plan, and we really, since that survey, it stood out to us, and we paid a lot of attention to it.
So without seeing Leah Summers on your org chart, what is that interaction like, and how does she inform your department?
Great. We actually work quite closely together. She's the mayor's advisor, and so represents the mayor a lot on the arts and culture. And so when we go through an objective, we're obviously coordinating quite closely with Leah, but the Arts Council has mainly a programmatic role in public art right now. But Leah's great at getting feedback from some stakeholders that would normally speak to the mayor if the mayor had time, for example, and things of that nature. So, yeah.
Okay. Any other
Am I missing
questions,
anything?
council members? Councilmember Fowler, then Johnston. Way to bring it, guys. All right.
So in our packets that we received that last week, we kind of have like the more expanded version of your summary. And one of the things that I noticed that really struck out to me, just because we're talking so much about housing, which I think we need, and we mentioned, I was in a meeting earlier today where if employers don't have somewhere for their employees to live, then it makes it a little bit more difficult to recruit them. But the other thing I noticed was the lack of really big space for these businesses to come into, right? Where I'm looking at the chart, for those of you that might have the expanded version up, but I'm looking at the chart on page 20 and, or the table, and it says, you know, the majority of space that we have available is in that 2,500 or less square footage range, which is like 10 people in an office, and that's concerning to me. It's incredibly concerning. I didn't realize that, but what are we, us, going to, like, how do we address this, and where is that in your goals here? Because if we're going to attract these big businesses, it seems like we need those two very vital things of where to house them in their workplace and where to house them, their employees, right? So where is that, and how are we addressing that?
That's a great question, and really it's woven throughout. Each of these goals has a little touch on this challenge, and again, we're really excited about the way that our divisions align. And so I'm going to have Danny talk about the Central Business District and specifically our goal of trying to get office product out of the ground there. But you're right, it is a challenge, and where the challenge really lies is it's difficult for a company to think 2 years in advance, and yet to build an office tower in downtown, you're talking about 18 to 24-month build time. Well, if companies aren't thinking that far in advance, without a guaranteed delivery date, they're choosing other areas. They're going south of here where you can slap up an office building in 12 months. So we continually lose some of these large projects because there is no place to put them. So we are working diligently, and Danny, do you want to talk about some of the things that we're pushing for?
Sure, yeah.
On that, why is it taking 18 to 24 months, and is there, what can be done, I guess, with that? And this is more just naivete probably than anything, so.
That's a great question, and it has nothing to do with the city's permitting time. I want to be really clear. It is actually the time of construction for a tower. To be able to build a concrete tower up, it takes 18 to 24 months. So it's not the city's process, it really is just the time of construction.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Laura's comments, that's one of the things as the agency we're looking at. We've started talking to developers and the financial institutions, and we're trying to develop a program that can hopefully bridge that gap between when they actually go out and announce a project and be able to get the financing for it, and when they're actually able to deliver a product to people who are interested in leasing it, and close that gap between someone who potentially is looking for office space in a 1, maybe 2-year time frame, and how that can then be tied into what developers are looking at, a 2 to 3 year time frame, and trying to get their project off the ground. So we hope to be bringing a program to the board that can help address that. We're also going to be having roundtable discussions with developers and property owners in terms of, is there something we can do with regard to the agency's programs and funding that we can try to figure out why there is that disconnect, why we're not seeing the office product coming online fast enough. Ben and his team with business development do a great job of recruiting and reaching out to people who are looking for that office space. We're just not able to bring it online in the time frame that they need. So what is causing that, and how can we address it, is what we're looking at. And it's something that we're getting calls as well from the agency of someone wants to come in and they want 100,000 to 200,000 square feet of office space, and whether it's availability of land, or whether it's just the fact that the developers aren't willing to necessarily jump the gun, or whether it's a function of the fact that they have to have pre-leasing requirements and the financing. We're in the process of trying to figure that out and see where we can address and target our goals and our resources to kind of help push that needle a little bit sooner.
Okay, Councilmember Johnston?
Thank you very much. To keep it short, first up, what are the metrics going to be on the dashboard? Do you anticipate in March?
They should be aligned with what is in the metrics dashboard that was presented in the strategic plan.
Okay.
They should be fairly aligned.
The other question that came up, and staff had this in the report as well, is outputs what you all do, which is great, and then the outcomes of what the businesses do. And so the goal is to do certain things that the business community react in certain ways to Salt Lake City, right? Do we have any sense of specific outcomes you could be evaluated on or evaluate yourselves on in the next 2 years, for instance, or longer?
One of the things that has been raised in a few different ways has been the overall tax base and the balance between the residents and businesses. We would love to be able to do that, but one of the challenges is with the way the state collects the tax information and then rolls it back down to the cities, we just can't do it. We don't have that information available to say how we're making an impact in that world. But we are amenable to feedback on our metrics. If the council has recommendations, we love metrics. We love to track. We love to know how and where we're moving the needle. One of the examples is the Net Promoter Score, for example. That's really like basically your customer survey score for local businesses, right? And how are we moving the needle on that? There's a very clear metric on if businesses are happy here or not, and that's one that we have to pay close attention to. So if the council has additional recommendations on some metrics besides what's in the presentation, we're welcoming to that and would love to get your feedback.
I agree with your example of the dashboard of the, I'll repeat it again, the survey.
Net Promoter Score.
Net Promoter Score,
Yeah.
excuse me. It's a great example, something specific that you can measure over time. But I'm looking to you to say, what else would you look for? Because I'm looking through, say, I'll have a question about the mission statement and vision, but how we know we're successful, essentially. If we can't get the data from the state on a tax base, for instance, or something else, and we can't get certain other quantitative measures, do you have other ideas about even things you're floating right now, you're not sure how you do it, but maybe it's an idea of where to go?
So businesses vote with their dollars.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, if companies are investing in Salt Lake City, that's a good metric that we're doing something right. If we're seeing jobs, unemployment rates stay low and job growth remain high, that's a good metric. And then, for some of the others like the arts, that we're providing arts opportunities for everyone in the community, and we can do that through multiple means, whether it's public art or events that we do. So that's another metric, is how many people are attending them. Are we keeping the cost of those programs modest? And then, with the RDA, they have a whole other set of metric, which is also based on investment. But really it comes down to, are we maintaining our tax increment? Are we growing our tax increment? Because that's really the goal of any good RDA, is to make sure that we're investing in things that are drawing new return to those areas.
So do you have the capacity, you think, to track those effectively? I mean, it's a simple idea, right? Is there more money coming into the city than we had before, or jobs, et cetera, but...
If the tools are out there, we're finding them. And the good news is we have a project coordinator that we've specifically tasked with helping us gather this intel and help us report it out on a regular basis. So watch for that coming soon.
Okay. I love the simpleness of the concept, right? If businesses are here, then yes, we're doing something right. We can drill down and say what it is we're doing right. Is it the culture? Is it the housing? Is it the tax? Whatever it is, the land. But you're right. At the end of the day, that's what is the ultimate outcome, right? Yeah. My next question is a little broader than just your department, so I apologize. But I'm taking it from your mission statement and your vision, right? Excuse me. So the mission statement is general. It says, "Be a vibrant, beautiful, prosperous, diverse, and authentic city." Close to a quotation. And obviously that has a lot more to do with not just you, but the rest of the city departments and a lot of things outside of our control. Are there any discussions from the administration or across departments about how do we operationalize those kind of objectives? Because I'm guessing those are pretty common to a lot of departments.
Well, I can give one practical example of how this rolls out in our work plan. In business development, for example, any proactive recruitment that we do in partnership with another part of the city. For example, sustainability right now, we're working on how do we create marketing materials that are specifically catered towards site selectors who in their portfolio have green businesses, like the type of people we want here in Salt Lake City. Then once we set up materials to market to them, how do we get that material in front of them, right? Do we go see them face to face? Do they have a magazine we put this in, right? So coming up with those platforms that align with the city's overall objectives are how we align in a simple way with what business development does.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not just your department. This is a question about the city, right?
Right.
If we know that businesses relocate here partly because of state tax policies, partly because of housing, right, and downtown culture, none of those have to do with what we think of as maybe traditional city objectives. How do we control it, right? And yet, as a city, we can do some things. It'd be interesting to say, across departments, how do we know that we are making it, I'll say, more beautiful, right? I mean, you're not doing parks yourselves, but that's sort of the discussion point about a mission statement. Would be nice to see multiple departments or sort of a unified objectives, because as a funder, it's good for me to say, all right, what bang for the buck is the most effective? What's going to help the city become beautiful in multiple departments? If there's an initiative or something that can be bridging 3 to 4 departments, but get to the same objective, it's much easier to fund that, right? So like I said, it's more than just you all. Going to your vision statement, though, a question about the research and innovation piece. We talk a lot about this in other, Pittsburgh's a good example of a place that's really touted their ability to harness multiple universities in a very small geographical location for innovation, right? In a district, they call it. We have the University of Utah, obviously, in SLIC, but the U with their research park. What specifics are we looking at in that realm for you all moving forward? What are the things we'll be seeing or sort of we working on?
So this is one thing we have. So we have a workforce development position coming on board here in March. So we're really going to build this out in a more robust way. Mm-hmm. But currently with our assets that we have in the department, we have a manager of local business and entrepreneurship who coordinates quite closely with the Lassonde Center and with, I'm losing the name, USTAR, right? And so, you know, wherever we can play that role right now in a reactive measure we are. So for example, it's something so simple as one of the biggest challenges the entrepreneur community is having right now is that when they come out of these incubators, they don't have space in the city. We're like, wait, that's a great challenge because that's the only available space we have in the city. And so one of the simple things that we've done is generate a report and send it out to those guys, right? To say, hey, just for awareness, you know, this is a space that's available in the city. And that's helping to keep entrepreneurs here, right? Instead of going out to different markets. So this is just one way that we're trying to work in that entrepreneur ecosystem right now, but we're definitely looking to build on that in the coming years. Yeah.
And we're really excited that we have a staff person dedicated to small business and entrepreneurship. So she's developing those relationships and helping to communicate in a way that brings back opportunities for us to make sure that we're capturing it within our annual work plans, within our budgets and our staffing.
Mm-hmm. And so thank you very much again. Excellent work. I am very, very, very interested in the dashboard. Obviously, the more simple, the better for outcomes for us. But drilling down to help me understand a little more about how we envision our city. We're not Pittsburgh. We're not Boise. We're not San Francisco. We're Utah or Salt Lake City, right? What is the balance between the tech industry, logistics we talk a lot about in the west end of the city, industrial park, right? Transport, and then those kind of things, and help me understand sort of us. What's our ratio? What are sort of our ideal for us, and what do we build on for our strengths? It helps me understand. In your report, you talk about politicians or leaders being evangelists for the city, understanding it enough to be able to talk about it and sell it. And that'd be very helpful for me as a simple social worker to understand a lot more and to be able to sell sort of the vision. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Look what we did. The 4 of us went overtime asking too many questions. I didn't even get to ask mine, but I'll make them as comments instead, that the workforce development position I would, whether it's offline or if we should set up a meeting, I'm curious how you integrate that position with Department of Workforce Services and also with the educators and the technical training entities that we have to bridge that gap. And we've talked about that, I think, since your very first interview with the council during advice and consent, maybe it was, how cities are seen as that catalyst to help merge those conversations between the education spectrum and the employment spectrum. So I am supportive and excited to see that in the budget upcoming, right? Also, the housing component felt like I should probably dig deeper into your report because it didn't feel fleshed out very much in this brief presentation. So I'd like to know more about the workforce housing partnerships that you are going to, or at least conversations that you're going to stay connected with, or how you connect employers with potential housing opportunities. I'd like to learn more about that. And then on goal 3 with the, I wondered about the building services audit implementation, because that was a really illuminating study that we did have an update on, and it was partially implemented, and I haven't really heard anything since then. So maybe I could request a follow-up meeting with some of you or all of you to learn more about how you're doing these things. But thank you, and with that, we'll excuse you from the table and move on to item 2 on our agenda, which is consideration of an ordinance for the neighborhood house rezone at 419, 422, 423, and 430 South, 1100 West. We may have Nick Tarbett, our council policy analyst, at the table, Nick Norris, or another planning representative, and Katya Pace. Hello, come on up. And Nick, do you want to kick us off?
I'll give just a quick intro.
And volley it over to planning after that?
That's all right with you.
Yes.
Basically, the next 3 items on the agenda all relate to the same issue. It includes a rezone, the closure of a street, and a public benefits analysis. So we're just going to let planning staff take care of it since they've been involved with all that. And
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a site for the neighborhood house that has been in operation in this neighborhood for approximately 60 years. It is a daycare for children and for adults. And what they want to do is to, right now there's 2 buildings separate for the adults and children. They would like to create a new building, for adults and children. And in order for them to do that remodeling on their site, they will need to do 3 things. One is the rezoning of these properties here on the north. The second one is a street closure that of 1100 West. This portion of 1100 West has been here.
Do you have a cursor? Because I'm not seeing it. Maybe it's, yes.
Sorry.
Can you back up and
okay.
highlight the rezone
So-
properties?
These are the properties that need to be rezoned.
Thank you.
From R1, 5,000 to institutional, which is the rest of the site. The other issue would be to vacate the street here, which Neighborhood House didn't realize that they had a street there. They just used that as a baseball field. So it's been on paper, but never actually a street. This area here in blue. And then the other request is to consolidate all these parcels, and that's going to be after the street closure. Then we will request subdivision amendment. Here's just a sort of the space where 1100 West is right now. And the third item that you're going to hear is going to be that they have asked the city to waive the requirement that we usually have to sell this property at fair market value. When we vacate a street, our policy is to sell it at fair market value, but since they are a nonprofit organization, they're requesting the city to waive that. But that's going to be your third item that you're going to be presented.
Thank you, Katya. Council members, do you have any questions? Comments? Councilmember Johnston, I bet you do.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here, and I appreciate Neighborhood House for the tour I took and understanding their situation. First question is, do you know the fair market value of that portion of 11th West at this point, what it would be?
That is on the public benefit analysis.
Yeah, I can't remember what it was.
And I'll have property management has prepared that document, and they, do you have that?
Sylvia Richards from the council staff said it's $96,660.
Just under 100 then?
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
96,000, you
Yeah.
said, Nick, ish?
660, yes.
And the acreage of it? 0.26 acres, thank you.
Okay. So for those of you who don't know, the Jordan River used to run right through the middle of this property up into the houses on Goshen Street, right in their backyards, and sort of bend back to where it currently is. And then they changed that in the 60s and straightened out the river, and that's where the Neighborhood House ended up on that property. So it used to be a river, essentially. And the new build is brand new right behind the current building, and from what it sounds like, it's going to be much more functional, both for adult and child daycare purposes. And I did ask them as well about trying to salvage, it's my view, historic building, mid-century modern sort of building, very beautiful, but it's, from what it sounds like, they can't renovate it effectively to make it useful at this point. So that's why they're changing to a whole new building structure. So I support it. I would like to know a little more about what our policy would be about vacating streets for nonprofits, if there is sort of some other thing in lieu, or the public benefit could sort of be tangible for us in some way. It's a policy going forward for us.
In that part of the project, I will let property management talk to you about that, because planning did not get as involved. We just knew that this was happening simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Katya.
So I guess I'm wondering about the existing qualifications for vacation that must be, and maybe qualifications is the wrong term, for consideration of vacation. Michaela, can you help me on that one, or is that also that might inform Councilmember Johnston, our consideration of the vacation plus the public benefit portion for waiving the fee? But I know I'm putting you guys on the spot. That's probably not
That's
something
fine.
we have on hand.
Want to talk? Go ahead. So we have about 4 policies for
Can you
street.
refer on a page to if
It's page 24 of the staff report.
okay,
So
thank you. We'll go there real quick. It's in the current item, right? In the rezone?
yes, it's the planning staff report, planning commission staff report. Do you have that? Is it part of the
It's on
page 24?
Or the planning staff report?
That's the beginning of.
So can I just read to you?
Please do.
So what we find in
Let me
the-
give a reference, council members. It's page 49 of 77 in our packet.
Okay.
Go ahead, Katya, thank you.
So is it the policy of the city council to close public streets and sell the underlying property? The council does not close streets when the action would deny all access to other properties. So in this case, it's not denying any access because it's paper only, never was built. Second, the general policy when closing a street is to obtain fair market value for the land, whether the abutting property is residential, commercial, or industrial. In this case, that's why they requested that waive, because they feel that they're providing a service to Salt Lake City.
So I think, Councilmember Johnston, you're saying that we could consider in the future an addition to or a clause in this second consideration that if the street closure or that the directive to obtain fair market value for street closure could be waived, or it could be considered to be waived if there is a public benefit established or something.
Yeah, just it makes sort of intrinsic sense, right? A nonprofit that serves
But we don't have a policy about
underserved
it.
folks, and that sort of, it totally makes sense. It just, there's no policy about it, so when it comes up again in another situation, is there going to be clear directive for different types of nonprofits? So Intermountain Healthcare is a nonprofit, very different situation, right? I'm not saying we wouldn't, but it'd be interesting to flesh that out a little bit for us to give some direction.
There was an alley vacation that we approved as a body, well, maybe last year in District 5, where, if you'll recall, they wanted to span with an apartment building over the alleyway, maintaining the alleyway, but using it for parking. And we approved it because we saw the benefit of increased housing opportunities in there. And I don't even think that they were affordable. I think it was just
No, it's not
increased market rate housing opportunities, and these are the kind of decisions that policy could help us. So let's set that aside with a note to staff, and maybe we need to do a straw poll with 4 of us here about whether or not we'd like to add to the list of potential ordinance policy considerations. Do you want to put a straw poll out there to?
Yeah, can we put it on the parking lot list
Yeah.
of stuff? I'd like to see us, I'd like to see an evaluation or proposed policy about gaining fair market value from street closures and what situations that would be appropriate, and how we'd evaluate when it was appropriate, when it wasn't.
And perhaps we could ask staff, our council staff, to talk with planning about whether or not there may be an opportunity to do a text amendment in this particular policy. I don't know if you've got it upcoming in the pipeline for some other reason, but.
Well, even if there may be other, not policy, but other sort of protocols already out there that sort of guide this. I mean, there's already recommendations, right? Staff will make recommendations based on the situation. There's got to be some sort of already some ways to evaluate this pretty effectively. I don't know we need a full policy as much as just help us understand a little bit about that as we make these decisions. So I don't want to sort of have to do a lot of research and recreate something that may already be there in some capacity.
So can I ask, just so that I'm clear, so currently the process is to go through the public benefit analysis, which is the third component that hand staff can talk about in a little bit. You'd like to see something potentially specifically in the standards of review when closing of an alley?
Well, I think the public benefit analysis may be the place to do it. Is there anywhere in there that helps me understand the threshold of how much is more than the public benefit? Because we're sort of evaluating the benefit of a nonprofit daycare versus, say, $100,000. I have no idea how to evaluate that. I don't know, is there a way in the
Can I make
It's
a
evaluated somehow. Yeah.
suggestion?
No.
The third piece that we stopped Katya at and didn't get to of the 4 considerations for street closure talks about the public benefit analysis, right? There should be sufficient public policy reasons to justify the sale and or closure. And that perhaps there's, I think it's actually a little more simple than we may be making it out to be, where the public benefit analysis could inform the general policy on obtaining fair market value, you know? Because it does say it's a general policy, which lends itself for reconsideration. Yeah, so could we just ask you to think about that so that future councils may feel so entitled to waive fair market? I'm not trying to predict what we're going to do here, but that there are certain considerations for housing, affordable housing, public benefit, community needs that we may want to have in policy. Is that sufficient, Andrew?
Yeah, and Madam Chair, I just want to endorse this current proposal. I agree that it's in the public benefit. I agree in waiving the fee or the sale and the rezone. So, thumbs
Great.
up for me.
And thank you. We'll try to not blur these two conversations. We're talking about the need for a future policy discussion and not meaning that that should reflect negatively on this particular application because we haven't yet had that discussion. Any other council questions? That easy.
That's good.
Okay. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Katya and Nick. I think we'll see you again, actually. Are you staying with us for sections 3 and 4?
Oh,
On here, can we just keep you up here and we'll,
Yes.
is there any additional, and Brian Fulmer, did you want to come up for this street closure portion, please? Thank you. Brian Fulmer, our council policy analyst, specializes in street closures and alley vacations. Brian, is there any discussion you want to kick us off with?
Well, to reiterate, the street is platted but has never been developed, never been used, and to the casual observer and even to the neighborhood house folks, they didn't realize the street was even there. It just appears that it's part of their campus, and so what they're wanting to do is formalize that. And if the street closure is approved, the plan is to rezone that to, or it would automatically become institutional per the policy to have whatever the property is rezoned to the surrounding properties. And if the rezoning goes through, everything around it would be zoned institutional.
Okay. Planning, anything else? Council members, anything else on this one? They all merge together.
Yeah, it's just 2 different ordinances. One is for the rezoning, and one is for the
Yes.
street closure, vacation.
And I keep you up here and move people around to make it clear that we're working through these separately. You can get up and switch seats if you want, because we're going to move on to item 4. Thank you, Brian, which is also about neighborhood house, but we're going to invite Sylvia Richards, our council policy budget analyst, up here, and Randy Hillier of the finance department. Ladies, you may stay if you don't mind. And we're going to talk about the public benefit analysis for the donation component. Sylvia?
I have no other details to add because we've already talked about them, but if the council moves forward, then you would be setting the date tonight for a public hearing on March 6th with a potential action on March 20th. And I'll turn it over to Randy.
Thank you.
I really don't have that much more to add other than in doing the public benefits analysis, we're fulfilling the requirements of State Code 10-8-2, looking at how this transaction is benefiting the city. And I think, as has already been discussed, it does provide a benefit to the city in supporting the lower income population of that area of the city. And I'm happy to try to answer any other questions you may have.
Council members? Johnston?
Neighborhood House has always been very kind and generous in offering the space for use by public meetings sometimes. There's not a lot of space, but there's some they've used. Currently, the fields have always been secured from public access, so is that going to continue forward? Maybe the Neighborhood House should ask, are there liability issues in having the field open to the parkway, for instance, and those kind of things? Or
Sure, come on up. You have to introduce yourself at the mic, and you can take Sylvia's generous seat right there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Nuttall. I'm the executive director at Neighborhood House. And it would remain fenced in based on the fact that we have two very vulnerable populations. So our aging and disabled adults need a secure facility so that wandering doesn't take place, especially those with Alzheimer's and dementia. We need a secure facility. And then we also serve really little kids from 15 months old up until 12 years old, and they also need a secure fenced-in facility. But like you mentioned, Councilmember Johnston, we do open the facility a lot for all kinds of different community events. And in fact, with the new building, we're hoping to be able to expand those possibilities and opportunities for our community to have resources that they need on the west side.
Good answer. Thank you. Anything else, council members? Are you sure? Because this is our last bite of 3 for the work session at this apple. Thank you all for being with us. As Sylvia mentioned, we're going to set the date for the public hearing. We already did, which we set on February 6th. We'll hold that public hearing March 6th, and then we are tentative scheduled to take out action on March 20th. Thank you all very much for being with us.
Thank you.
With that, we'll move on a little bit ahead of schedule. If Wayne Mills is here. Is Wayne here yet? Hey, Wayne, come on up. We are ahead of schedule, but everybody's here. We're going to go on to item 5, which is an ordinance for planned development zoning text amendment. Now we've got Nick Norris, Nick Tarbett, and Wayne Mills. Nick Tarbett. No, Nick Norris?
We'll let Wayne Mills.
Wayne
lead
Mills.
out. That's all right.
Just go right down the line. It's kind of like the Three Stooges. Thank you very much. This is a petition initiated by the Planning Commission to review and modify the Plan Development Ordinance. Plan development is a special development approval process that allows the Planning Commission to modify zoning standards in an effort to get a better project than what might be allowed under strict compliance with zoning. Through the Planning Commission's review of plan developments over the years, they've identified issues with the current regulations in relation to their to what their authority is under that ordinance, and also the specific standards for review. They've had issues with trying to determine whether or not a project is compatible with the adjacent neighborhood, and really if we're getting a better project than applying the strict code versus basically just granting variances. To summarize the purpose of the changes, the proposed amendments are intended to ensure that a plan development is meeting a city-wide planning objective, ensure that the design of the project is compatible with adjacent development, and clarify and simplify zoning regulations related to plan developments. I'll just give you a very brief overview of some of the more substantial changes of the code that are being proposed. The first one is the purpose and objectives. The current ordinance has a list of objectives that the city seeks to achieve through the plan development process. Those objectives have become a little bit out of date. So what we've done is propose objectives that are more specifically related to goals stated in the various citywide master plans, such as Plan Salt Lake. And also within each objective is a list of strategies that can be used to try to meet that objective. The next change is the change to the review standards. These review standards are really the teeth of the plan development chapter. The current standards lack sufficient criteria to ensure that a project is compatible with the neighborhood that's being proposed in. And the proposed changes put a much more emphasis on compatibility with the neighborhood and the need to meet a planning objective. It's a citywide planning objective. There's also a number of specific design review standards that are kind of spread all throughout the code, so we try to consolidate those to make it easier for the Planning Commission, also make it easier for the public and developers to understand. The next change is the authority of the Planning Commission. The ordinance currently states the Planning Commission has the authority to modify any zoning or subdivision regulation, with the exception of land use, residential density, and in some cases, building height. One of the problems is that this authority is kind of spread out all over the code right now, and the Planning Commission has always struggled a little bit with what their authority actually is, so we consolidated everything into one area in the code. And we've also clarified that language on what it is that the Planning Commission has authority to do under this process. A couple of things that we added to this process is, one is off-site parking. It's really kind of a technical zoning, geeky zoning thing, but off-site parking is when you're trying to meet your required parking not on the property that it's located on. It's actually a land use in our code, and because our code says that that's a land use and Planning Commission can't modify land use, it's become a bit problematic because in a lot of times planned developments have multiple parcels, but they'll all kind of share parking in one parcel. We've kind of made that work in some instances, but this really clarifies the code and allows us to do that thing, which is actually really important for these larger developments, that we can have kind of a consolidated parking area kind of towards the back and put our development towards the front.
Do they need to be contiguous? Parcels?
Not necessarily, no. But in this case, with the plan development, they need to be within the actual plan development area. But you can do off-site parking outside of a plan development in the zoning districts that it's allowed. It doesn't necessarily have to be contiguous, but it has to be within, I think it's a certain number of feet, 500, 600 feet away from the property.
Okay, thanks.
The other thing that we added to what the Planning Commission can approve is related to density. The Planning Commission cannot approve a plan development that exceeds the allowable residential density of the zone. And that's something that's always been in the plan development ordinance. We looked at ways that the Planning Commission had an interest in trying to increase density through the plan development process. We looked at some ways, but it really kind of became a much bigger project and out of the scope of what we were really trying to do with this plan development change. But through our public involvement process, some ideas popped up that that maybe we look at doing a density bonus, or basically kind of ignoring those density regulations in our RMF zones, where a proposal is to eliminate a non-conforming commercial use and put in a conforming residential use. And this is pretty important in kind of like the East Central area of downtown, because in those areas we have a lot of non-conforming commercial, medical office buildings and stuff like that, and so this would allow those to actually convert to conforming residential uses. Excuse me. The other change that we're doing is proposing is outside of the plan development chapter, but it deals with multiple buildings on one lot, and this is actually what generates a lot of our plan development requests. It's really confusing language in the code, so we're looking at clarifying that language, and also making it so in those districts such as manufacturing and open space and business park districts, where really the development pattern is to have multiple buildings on a lot, is to allow those by right as opposed to going through a plan development process to try to streamline some of our development processes. And then there's a number of other changes in the code that are really put in place to really just simplify the code and clarify the regulations. So the Planning Commission has reviewed this proposal in 2 work sessions and also in a public hearing, and recommends approval of the text changes.
Great. Nix? Nothing?
I think the only thing I'll add, and Wayne touched on this a little bit, is that this is part of one of our kind of key goals for 2017 was looking at a number of our processes to streamline them so that they work better. This is a key component of that. Plan developments are one of the things that at the staff level take up a significant amount of our time. I think the average staff hours dedicated to one plan development application is close to 80 hours. If that gives you an idea of how much time we actually spend looking at these types of things. And most of them are relatively simple types of things. The multiple buildings on a single lot in the M1 zone, where we have two big warehouses, one doesn't have street frontage. Those really should be by right, because we don't get any sort of, there's never any issues identified with them. Instead, it just seems like we're taking someone through a process just to take them through a process. We want to focus the plan development on helping us achieve city benefits and goals outlined in our master plans. And so that's one of the key changes not changes, but one of the key goals that we're trying to accomplish with this proposal.
Good work, Wayne and team, if this was your product.
We had
It's Wayne's product.
Well, we had a big team in the planning division that worked on this, so actually it was a good, solid team effort to put this together.
Council members, questions? I want to know what's next. So you said you guys are taking on these time-consuming, needing streamlining
We are.
zoning issues.
So there's two more on your agenda, or on your briefing next. But next in the pipeline that's going to the Planning Commission in the next month is the conditional building and site design review process, which is also a very significant one. I think our applications for conditional building and site design review are up about 100% over the last 3 years.
Wow.
So another very time-consuming thing. We don't do a lot. We do maybe 30 a year, but those 30 a year are a lot of work. And so hopefully that will be an improvement there as well. And then we have some other, then after that we have special exceptions, which I know everyone will be excited about.
Good times, wow. Thank you, planning. Council members, anything you want to ask, comment, complain, whatever? We're ahead of schedule.
Here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it sounds good. We thank you for being with us, and it looks like we're going to we already set a public hearing. We're taking public comment on March 6th, and we're set up to take action on this on the 20th. Thank you, Nick, Wayne.
Perfect. You're welcome. I think I'm staying here.
Okay. Nick Norris, okay, Michaela's back. We're going to move on to item 6, an ordinance that is looking at regulations for demolition and economic hardship processes in local historic district amendments. We've got Nick and Michaela with us.
Lex should be coming down.
I know, we're ahead of schedule, so Lex is forgiven for not,
Attack.
for walking in on time. Thanks, Lex.
Here it is.
Who would like to start us off?
Me?
Not Lex, he just sat down.
Sorry,
No, we're ahead of
running
schedule.
down the hallway. This is a petition that was generated actually a long time ago in 2009 in order to clarify and fix our regulations for demolition in our historic districts. For various reasons, it was never really acted upon, but it came to the forefront here in the last couple of years, particularly the last year, when we've had, I believe it's 14 demolition requests in 2017. And at that time, it became very apparent that our demolition and economic hardship processes are in need of amending. I can go through the amendments that we're proposing if you would like, line by line. If not,
What's the next most efficient? I mean, we have plenty of time, but let's not pull teeth.
let me just hit upon the big items. In our demolition regs, there is one of the standards refers to the economic hardship process. And so when we're looking at demolition, to have that as a standard, when we have a whole process for that is somewhat misplaced. And so we're proposing to remove that. If an applicant goes through the demolition process, is denied, and wants to pursue the economic hardship process, we have a full process for that. The next thing that is important is that right now we have a process by which if you achieve a set number of standards, then you would be approved. If you hit that middle ground, there is a waiting period that can be imposed, and if you hit just one or two standards, you can be denied. We're proposing to remove that current process and have that replaced with a process where if you substantially meet criteria, then you would be approved. If you don't meet it, you would be denied. It's much more black and white. It's easier for the public, developers, the Landmark Commission, even planning staff to administer.
So keeping the same 6 standards?
Yes.
Saying you need to meet a majority?
Yes, you would substantially need to meet those standards in order to demolish.
I guess I'm wondering about the word substantially, and are the standards such that, welcome Councilmember Kitchen, and I didn't welcome Councilmember Luke. We now have a little more than a quorum. Are they such that an applicant could mostly meet a standard but not entirely, and that they could have some fractional achievement of multiple standards and get to 3.5-ish, or you know what I'm trying to ask here?
Yeah, and I think that would be possible, and it would be at the discretion of the Landmark Commission to make the decision as to what substantial means in that case.
Really make that
Councilmember
value judgment, sorry.
Councilmember Fowler and then Councilmember Luke.
I guess my only question, this is more just my legal brain working more than anything, is the word substantially somewhere defined within the ordinance so that somebody who is reading the ordinance would know beforehand what that expectation is in order to meet that? Does that make sense? I think if it's defined, that makes it clearer, because it's a hard word to just kind of throw out there and hope somebody understands what that means.
We don't define substantially, but in any other of our discretionary processes, it's always substantially meets the standards of the ordinance. So I
Do
know
we
that's
have
not a
that in
perfect
lots
answer.
of places and it's not defined anywhere? Oh, okay, great, good to know.
And
Just
those
opens
other
us right up.
those other processes are like plan development and conditional building and
buildings.
site design review and
Conditional uses.
conditional uses, things of that nature.
And those weren't parts, that language wasn't part of the cleanup process.
It was or was not.
It doesn't sound like it was. We just heard from the planned unit development cleanup process in our previous agenda item, and the word substantial wasn't discussed. So maybe it isn't coming up as an issue for the department. Anything else, Councilmember Fowler? Councilmember Luke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Couple of questions. So first off, how often is the economic hardship process utilized?
Rarely.
Okay.
Okay,
now I'm not an attorney, so but do you have a definition of rarely?
Well, let me state this. Until last year, it was not common for us to see requests for demolition.
Okay.
I'll be here 8 years this year. This was the first one this year. And so we've been muddling through this process, this is super timely that the mayor initiated the petition for us to fix this process, because we actually have, applications, and we're just right in there with the language and trying to improve it with the applicant and identifying issues with it, but it is rare.
Okay. So is the intent then with this that, well, not the intent, but do you anticipate that you'll start seeing this option utilized more frequently with these changes?
we might see it more frequently. I think so, just because and I'm kind of just speaking with my own opinion, you know, lots of renovations of historic buildings in the last 5 or 6 years have occurred, and there are just those outliers or those buildings that are in terrible condition that still are considered historic, and this would be the appropriate process to kind of weigh the economics against whether it's a taking or not.
Okay.
Is that a good
Yeah,
answer?
I think we do expect to see more challenges. When we have periods of high development pressure, that impacts not only places where it's easier to develop in the city, but also our historic districts. And so as long as our development economy is what it is, we're going to keep seeing these types of applications.
Okay, thank you.
Michaela, I missed if you mentioned which specific application it was, but I'm wondering if this would affect the properties north of the Other Side Academy on 7th East.
That one property with the Other Side Academy actually got an approval from demolition because they appealed. They were put into that because there was one standard with the demolition process. The Landmark Commission had to put it in that waiting period, that bona fide preservation period. And they appealed to the mayor, and she overturned that one standard based on the substantial evidence, which is within that authority. And so they will be receiving their certificate of appropriateness, so they don't need to go through the process.
So that building's coming down.
That's correct.
Yeah, Councilmember Fowler.
Because we have a clear example, I think this will help my brain work, but this new change, would that building north of the Other Side Academy have substantially met those requirements such that it would not have been placed in that bona fide historic preservation waiting period?
I would say yes, because the way it was written, there was a strict tier, and because there was one that the commission couldn't make a finding on, they had to go into the waiting period.
Right, because we had
Substantial,
those
they have the gray
6
area.
things, and if you
Right.
met this or you didn't meet that exact number, right? But
Exactly.
in this case, you're saying that it's likely that they would have met that substantial wording and requirement under this new potential text amendment change, such that they would not have had to appeal.
That's correct.
Okay.
The other thing that this proposal does is that it's cleared up some of the confusing language in those standards. So that one standard that particular project got hung up on was basically saying that said something along the lines of the underlying zoning does not, or
The underlying zoning is incompatible with the structure, use of the
right,
structure.
which just doesn't make sense. The new proposal basically says that the base zoning of the site does not permit land uses that would allow the adaptive reuse. And so we get to take into account more, not just what the land use is, but if the land use is actually, if it's feasible to do it in that building. So it broadens that a little bit and makes it easier for the Landmarks Commission to make a decision.
I interrupted before I think maybe you were done, Lex, with the talk about the critical changes.
You didn't interrupt, that's fine. That's really the summary of the demolition changes. In terms of the economic hardship, we really reworked that whole section just to make it more clear, more simplified. The biggest thing with those changes were instead of having a list of things that applicants are required to submit for that, which the list was very lengthy, because the impetus to prove economic hardship is on the applicant, we changed that list to a laundry list of things that they could provide instead of having them go get a bunch of information that may or may not be relevant just because it's required. Now, what you would do is you would submit things that you think can make your case to prove economic hardship. And the second thing that is substantial is currently there's a 3-person economic review panel, and that consists of one of the landmark commissioners, a representative of the applicant, and then somebody that those two folks choose as a third. We are proposing to get rid of that system. It's proven problematic. Basically what happens is that the decision falls down to that third person, and it just doesn't work very well.
I wondered who makes the appointment in the new system?
It is a qualified expert that would be appointed by the planning director.
And is there a definition to qualified?
Yeah, that's in the ordinance, I believe, that of what their background would be.
Okay,
Yeah, that's part of the ordinance.
so they would serve in sort of a appeal officer
Very
type
similar to that.
position.
Something that we have them on retainer, but we don't, we give them the information and they go. It's not we don't have an influence necessarily over what they would do. The whole intent of that is for them to determine whether or not we are essentially creating a regulatory taking of property by not allowing the demolition of the structure. So very technical, legal, economic decision.
Okay, then we've got some, Councilmember Wharton, go ahead.
I just want to say this is something that it comes up in my district a lot because of our historic houses, and I feel like you're saying, and I read through these materials, that it's not really that you're changing the standards of what it takes to make these changes, either construction or to prove hardship, but just making clarifications on what the existing standards should be. Would you say that that's accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay, because the thing that I hear the most is that the complaint that I hear the most isn't so much that, I hear on both sides, but that it's not that their regulations are too strong or not strong enough, but that they're not clear. And people, whether they're proponents of historic preservation or whether they're wanting to build new construction, feel that they can't sit down with the ordinance before they plan something and say, we think we're going to pass or we think we're going to fail, but it feels to them very much like they're in the dark. So I really appreciate this. The only thing I wanted to say or to ask about in terms of proving the hardship is that I know that take Bishop's Place, for example, is another one that's in my district, another example that will help me understand this. Will the changes to this make it any simpler to prove economic hardship in that on that particular project, in your estimation?
I would say no, because the determination isn't changing
right.
the type of information. It's just the process is what we're fixing when it comes to the economic hardship.
Okay, but sorry, I should have clarified. So since they have the affirmative duty to prove the economic hardship, does having a list of things that are required versus a list of things like, here's an example of what you could provide, do you think that like fundamentally changes the process?
No, what it does is that some of those things that right now the ordinance says are required to be submitted, sometimes they're not relevant to that particular project, and so they couldn't possibly
be
submitted. And so this is simply making it, giving us some more flexibility on those types of things. But it still is up to that applicant.
They still need to make their case.
Yeah, if they're not going to submit enough documentation to demonstrate there's a hardship, then you couldn't possibly find that there's a hardship.
Okay, great, thank you.
Councilmember Johnston.
Sure. A quick question on the substantially the wording there. One of the concerns that people have voiced in the past about the Historical Landmarks Commission was it was hard to sort of forecast or know what you're going to get for a decision, because it was very, it wasn't sort of black and white. And there's good reasons to do that sometimes, I understand that. Does this put us closer to that realm again, saying you have to meet a substantial sort of intent of this, of the demolition? How do people sort of, when they come before the commission, how do they understand that they don't have to have like 3 or 4 or 2 out of 6. It's sort of a substantial number. Is there a way to sort of help clarify that for folks who come before the commission?
Yeah, I would say there is. Because these are pretty complicated decisions, it's hard to come up with something where somebody could look at, oh yeah, I know I'm going to get approval or I'm going to get a no. I think we do our best at the staff level to walk them through each and every standard so that they know what the Landmarks Commission is going to be, it has to review, and so that they can prepare themselves the best they can. We're not going to make their argument for them, but we will help them explain what certain things mean. We will give ideas about what other people have done in the past, what the planning or what the Landmarks Commission has found on similar types of projects and things like that, so that they have something to go off of. But yeah, we really are trying to make it, and we couldn't really codify that kind of stuff. That's something we have to do on the front end, and hopefully that's something that we will be better at than we have been in the past. We've been decent about it, I'd say, maybe even good on some things, but we can always find areas to improve on how we communicate what standards mean and things like that to applicants.
So the flip side of that is for the Historic Landmarks Commission. Are they able to interpret substantially for themselves, say a majority of these are met, or they weigh certain ones more than others? Is that up to them to determine?
It's up to them, and we provide a recommendation, but they have to substantially comply. If you had a historic home and you came in with some sort of alteration to your home, they're used to making those decisions.
Yeah.
And discussing it amongst themselves on whether to go one way and discussing the standards. So they're fully used to making those decisions.
Yeah, they also, and this is a credit to the Landmarks Commission, they went through both of these ordinances that you're reviewing line by line, meeting after meeting, and they spend a lot of time discussing these same types of issues, and they got to the point where they were comfortable with the ordinance helping them make decisions versus what they have now.
Oh, thank you very much.
That's helpful to hear also. Council members, anything else on this one? Thank you. Councilmember Luke, please.
One thing, just as this is moving forward, and it goes to Councilmember Fowler's question about the definition of substantially. I don't think that we necessarily need to look for like a dictionary definition of what that is, but we all know that of all of the issues that planning and zoning deals with, this is the one that tends to be the most, it can be the most political. And I think the more predictability that we can add to this, the better, so that we take you guys out of, the interpretation role. And I don't know, is it even possible to come up with something that's not, the word, using the word substantially, that clarifies a little bit what we're looking for, so that predictability is there? Or is that the best that you guys can come up with?
I think if I recall correctly, we discussed this quite a bit with the Landmarks Commission. I don't, off the top of my head, remember the outcome other than what's in the ordinance right now, but we can certainly look and get help from our attorney's office on, is there a way that we can define that? Right now, if we don't define a term in our zoning ordinance, the ordinance defers us to Webster's dictionary.
Okay.
So even though we may not have that definition.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I think that would be helpful, to see if there's anything else that y'all could come up with. That said, my support for this isn't hinging on that. I just think it would be helpful to clarify it a little bit if possible.
Please.
And this is just for my own benefit. I was looking through these changes and noticed that, let me find the page. We took out that there would be no reuse plan. I'm just curious as to why we had it and why we're taking it out now. Except otherwise to make things a little bit simpler, but.
I can talk about that. Because when developers were coming in, and we've had these recent demolition applications, they'd be looking through every standard. Are you contributing? Really asking these historic questions. And then it would require the Landmark Commission to do a full new construction review of that replacement with a reuse plan. And the developers were saying this is such an enormous cost to us when we don't even have the question of whether we can demolish this right now. You're mixing these processes, and we were like, acknowledge that, yes, absolutely, we are mixing these processes. The first demolition question should be, is it historic? Is it going to hurt the district? Is it going to hurt the streetscape? All those historic questions, then do you get your approval to demolish? Then the next question will be, what are you replacing it with? Then the developer or the applicant or the homeowner should be spending that money on all the plans and all the planning, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and just again, sort of my own layman's terms on this, is so essentially once that first question is answered and it's an approval, let's say, they can go back, and if it doesn't fit the zone of that district, then it can be denied, or the plans can be denied based on whatever that next step looks like.
Exactly.
But they're kind of getting through that first initial step first without spending extra money on something that may not even come to fruition at all.
Exactly, exactly.
All right.
And it adds more time for them too.
Anything else, council members? Then Lex, we shall set you free, but we're going to keep the three of you for our next item, our last one before a little break we're going to take, which is item 7, ordinance looking at regulations for new construction in local historic district amendments. Michaela, Nick, and Nick. Michaela, you want to?
Okay. Well, I have to give some kudos to Anthony Reeder. He has left Salt Lake City, but he worked on our preservation team, and he was the project manager. But I'm happy to discuss this actual petition. So the standards for new construction really haven't been changed in 20 years at Salt Lake City. So they've been on the books since 1995. And as some council members that have been on the council for a number of years, you've seen the adoption, and you've been part of the adoption of our design guidelines, which are advice to homeowners or developers trying to design appropriately in our local historic district. As Nick was alluding to, and I've talked about, in the past few years, due to the economy, we have seen very large, complicated infill new construction development in our local historic districts, and we've been trying to grapple with those as best as possible. And part of the mayor's study, again, was to take a look at these new construction standards to make improvements to them. And we've just been discussing these internally and with designers and with applicants. And in a nutshell, we think that what we've proposed will improve predictability. That predictability where a developer who may not be an architect and actual architects can come in and go through those standards, use our design guidelines, and have some sort of sense that they're going to either get an approval or maybe be somewhere in the middle to make their case or not be meeting the standards. And really the purpose of these is to have compatible new buildings in our local historic districts, right? So when you're driving by, they're compatible enough that they don't draw your eye and you don't think, wow, who approved that? So what they do, the standards are more user-friendly, hopefully, and clear. They use the same terminology as we do with those more updated design guidelines, so that when you're looking at the code and you're looking at that handbook, you're using the same words. That's helpful. It's helpful for staff in writing clear reports. This code also explains how the design guidelines are used. We've been challenged by some that we don't even have to look at your adopted design guidelines because it's not code, it's really just advice. Well, your intent was to have it be advice to help inform this code. So we've codified that. Another biggie is that predictability bit on what an applicant for new construction should submit, so that we get a full submittal and we can go full steam ahead as staff, working with that developer, writing our reports. And we have a pretty good list that's been informed by years of what the Landmark Commission has also felt useful. So with that, any questions? Be happy to talk about new construction.
Councilmember Kitchen.
I'm looking at the council staff report, and on page 2, it speaks to 21A.34.020H6B, materials on street facing facades. It looks like we have called out vinyl siding and aluminum siding for areas not facing the public street. Is that right?
Let me just find. the
Prohibited for
council
use
staff
on facades
report.
which do face the public street, excuse me. Did we consider including stucco in that list as well?
I think the challenge with stucco is that stucco is a historic building material. What most people are referring to when they're talking stucco really is what's technically called an exterior insulating finishing system, which is far different than the historic stucco types of products that are out there. So historic stucco is a thin concrete-based thing that's troweled on layer after layer after layer that we do have on a lot of our historic buildings in the city. So when we say
about the fake
stucco,
stucco?
no, I don't think that we'd want to say no, but
We've approved stucco, certainly, and it's just that those IFAS or EFIS systems, and some architects would say that they're more energy efficient sometimes, but real stucco would be something that would be appropriate, as Nick would say.
What about fake stucco, or whatever we're calling it?
Yeah, they would definitely discuss that at the Historic
So
Landmark
it would be
Commission.
permitted?
I think as probably an accent, kind of more accent features, it's just a durability type of question.
Yeah. I'm not anti-stucco, I just want to limit
Yeah,
the
right,
Band-Aid
right.
colored, buildings that we've got going up around town, so.
I think we
even
all
in
would like to
historic
see
districts,
that
right?
change.
I mean, even if it was stucco, they would have to articulate the buildings, set windows back, and, have dimension on that facade as well, but
Thank you.
I take your point.
No?
Yeah, I just have a very quick
Councilmember
one.
Luke?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, so Derek is not anti-stucco. I am anti-stucco.
Okay.
Unless it's historic stucco, I guess, but anyway, just wanted to say.
For the record.
For the record.
Great.
We'll take a straw poll on stucco.
Or the
Anything?
distinction between real stucco and the other.
Council members? All right. It's going to be that easy for you. We set a public hearing date on the 6th, which is going to be held on March 6th. And then we can potentially take action March 20th. Thank you, Michaela and Nick.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to take a break. And we're not scheduled to come back for 45 minutes, but I think I'd like to see if we could get Lance Allen with us before that. So can we reconvene here? Jennifer Bruno, do you have a time recommendation that we come back? 4:10. That's still quite a long time. 4:10. Thank you. All right, we're going to get started. That clock says we're late, but my computer says it's 4:10. We're right on time. And we'd like to invite Lance Allen, who's actually been here all along in the back. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, no problem.
And for being willing to start early on item 9 on our agenda, refuse code revision in the ordinance.
So the department is recommending that we change the definition of recyclable items in section 9.08.0010 of the city code. Currently, the definition has a list of recyclable items and requires the department to post those. The problem is that what is actually recyclable hinges on two things: whether someone will buy the material and whether a processor actually has the technology to pull the material out of the stream. A perfect example of that is plastic bags, which the current technology of the processors that we have in the valley cannot remove that from the stream. Therefore, it gets bound up in the equipment, causes damage, which they charge back to the city, and they end up throwing the stuff in the trash anyway. So that was one of the items we wanted to remove from the definition, and then we wanted to be able to change those definitions as the technology and the markets dictate. So that's the two main things that we want to do with that ordinance.
Can you tell us more about the increased charge amount?
On the recycling? Or is it the next one?
You know, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the fees, so I need to go to the
I
other
got
one.
confused too.
Councilmember Kitchen, did you have a comment while I get my head in the game?
Sure. This is a comment not necessarily for you, but for the body. And so obviously this is an important update, but I couldn't help but think all along while reading through the paperwork that we really need to move on our formerly stated goal of banning plastic bags from grocery stores. Because if they can't be recycled and they're lost in the stream of waste, then maybe we shouldn't have them any longer. I know that there's some organization happening at the state level. I don't know where it's going to go this session, but I think it's high time that the city and our Department of Sustainability and begin to dialogue with retailers and us as policymakers so that we can finally get rid of plastic bags in our community.
Thanks, Councilmember Kitchen. That's a policy priority that Councilmember Rogers raised. Yeah, was it the beginning of your first term? And I know that there's some interest in the community, quite a bit of interest to see us lead out on that locally. So, any other comments, council members?
I do,
Questions?
actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this at all tied to the changes in the waste transfer station?
No.
No?
No,
Okay,
it's
there's-
tied to what's happening in China with the markets.
Yeah.
And they're raising their rules on the amount of contamination that actually be in the bales and the material that's sold over there. And so it's down to 0.05%, which is like purer than ivory soap. So it's almost unrealistic expectations. So you're seeing the processors push back on every single possible contaminant that's showing up in the stream.
And plastic bags are a contaminant.
Yes. Now, there are ways to recycle plastic bags, but not through our current program.
What would we have to do in order to accommodate plastic bags?
It's the education program which we're undertaking right now, is first educate the residents not to use them, preferably to use the reusable bags. 2, if they do use the plastic bags, to return them to the market where they purchased the material from. So there are several different grocery stores and other entities that will accept those plastic
So
bags.
it's a reuse strategy, not a recycle strategy, right?
They can take them in and recycle them.
I see.
Yeah, but they're isolated, they're in by themselves, so they don't get cross-contaminated with food or other material, and it's like plastics. If you look at a plastic bag, you'll probably see a 2 or a 4 on the bottom, but you can't tell the difference by looking at the bag, but the chemical makeup is different. By taking them back to the store you bought them from, you're going to have more of the same type of bag. But they'll take all film. It's not just the plastic bag issue, it's really a film issue for your dry cleaners, that type of thing.
I was just going to ask for an update on the neighborhood cleanup and the community survey, and if you're willing to just give us a verbal update there.
Yeah, so we've decided on a program. We're looking just operationally a couple of minor details, but we plan on having something out first part of next month. And then we're going to reach out to all the community councils, to the councils as well, and begin a robust education program around that process.
You've done this really well all along already, but just make sure you send us information as council members, and we can help push that out to our community as well. Most of us send a newsletter, I think, so there's ways that we can help spread that message as well.
You got it. Thank you.
Isn't that next on our agenda?
Yes. On item 10. Well, it's really about the fees. What, go ahead. No, I'm sorry, but we can take questions later.
I think that was wrapped into the next item though as well, with the fees, right?
Which?
The bulky waste.
It's
proposal.
It's part of this one, and it's that the second proposed amendment in this proposal is around bulky waste definition.
Yeah.
So it's in this one.
Yeah, okay, this one.
Okay. Any other questions?
I had one more quick one.
Go ahead.
With the increased fees, do we anticipate those will cover the actual cost of bins and haulaway and all those kind of things, or is it still going to be a deficit kind of thing?
Is this on the event fees?
No, I'm not. The event fees, yeah, but just the, I think it was the event fees, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's move on, because it's you anyway, Lance. So we'll pick up with item 10, the consolidated fee schedule amendment for sanitation special events. Lance, do you want to give us an intro? And then clearly Councilmember Johnston's ready to go on this one.
Sure. So in looking at all the costs of the program, we're always very concerned about what I call ancillary programs that are outside of the scope of what we actually charge the residents for, and this being the event fees that we charge. Looking at those fees and doing a close analysis of the costs associated with providing that services, we found out, especially on a certain larger events, we're grossly undercharging for those services. So when we evaluated the actual costs of the services were provided and benchmarked against some of the public sector to make sure we're not, private sector, make sure we're not out of the norm, it was obvious that we were undercharging for that service. So it's what we decided we looked at doing is breaking it as a kind of a tiered approach, with 100 cans being the break-off, because that's the number of containers we can actually fit on our truck to take out to these events. So anything above that, we required a second trip or a second truck to make the cart delivery and removal. And so as you can see, some of the events that got hit or we're proposing to raise the fees on is the larger events. The smaller events don't see near the impact, because then it just comes down to the delivery. We look at a delivery fee as delivering the cart plus removal of the cart plus one dump. And then anything above that where we run into problem is the ones we have multiple dumps within the time that the event operates.
Okay, Councilmember Johnston, do you have any questions there?
Yeah, so on the event charge for waste haulaway, bins are brought out and then they're hauled away for you at the end of the event. For a small event, I'm thinking of, say, Groove in the Grove and Poplar Grove, which is, I don't know if it's the smallest event, but pretty small event. Would there be a charge increase for that level as well, the smallest?
Yes, even the smallest event will see a small
But
rate.
would it be incremental based on the size of the event you're talking about?
Yes. Yes, it's broken out by the number of cans that they would get, and then the number of dumps that they'd have in addition to the final dump and removal of the can. So if an event just received the carts, used it over the weekend, then we retrieve the carts on Monday and had to dump them, there would be one fee.
Okay.
And it's the ones that we deliver the carts one day, and then over several weeks they get emptied, and then we remove the cart. Those are the ones where there had never been a charge in place prior.
Okay, so it's a new charge for that level of service.
Right. So
This-
in essence, a large event that had 10 containers for a weekend versus a large event that had 10 containers over several months, they were charged the same.
Okay. Is there going to be an explanation for folks who are, say, this year in a new event, and they're surprised by an increased fee from the previous year?
Yeah, we've already reached out to the large events and had one-on-one conversations with them.
Okay.
And there's many of the others that's been spoken to over the phone, but all of them will receive a clear explanation of the events once the ordinance passes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wharton?
Hello. So I've been contacted by some of the festivals that happen in our city, and they're really concerned about these additional charges that we keep adding, to the point that they're concerned that it might make it financially impossible for them to continue in this location. I know you said that you've had some phone conversations with them, excuse me, phone conversations with interested parties, but have we actively sought their feedback? And I would say, can we do that before moving forward with this so that we can get a better understanding from them of how this will impact some of our biggest events in the city?
Yeah, we've had a lot of outreach with them, and we've had several meetings that we've met with them face to face, and we've looked. In fact, this has been going on for a couple of years that we've been looking at this possibility. So there's been a lot of education with helping them to right-size their service so they don't have more service than they actually need. But yeah, by all means, I'm happy to sit down with them and have that discussion. But my concern is we don't put ourselves in the position where the residents who are paying the rates for the service are getting burdened with this extra cost.
I think Jennifer Bruno has something to add.
In the past, when the council has struggled with this idea of wanting to recover budget for a service that's provided by the city versus adequate notification so that events can sort of plan it into their budget, sometimes the council has had a delayed effective date. So in other words, you delay it for the next season or, for the next year. Obviously, that would have a revenue impact for the current year, which is another thing to consider. The other thing that the council has done in the past is to appropriate a pool of grant funds, which right now, that was the genesis of the Signature Event Fund, which is now the ACE Event Fund, was sort of the first time the city made a policy choice to recover fees for services that were being provided to events. That was sort of meant to soften the blow a little bit. And so the council could take that up in a budget amendment this year in order to sort of soften the blow for some of those events of this change if you didn't want to delay the effective date. So those are just some options to consider.
Councilmember Fowler.
Is there a way, and this may be more for staff, I'm not sure, so is to kind of look at what the economic loss to the city would be if these larger events decided to not participate here in the city with us. Because I know that that is a very real possibility. And I know that through fees and these types of fees and rental fees and service fees, the city does at least recoup some. So it'd be interesting, I think, to look at sort of that balance for some of these larger events, if there was a way to either look at waiving fees or having a possibility or a policy of not, if it's a nonprofit or something along those lines, if it makes some sort of economic sense of what we could potentially lose versus whatever amount we may gain by raising fees, right? I think that that is something we need to be looking at as well. And again, I'm not sure if that's a task for you or a task for staff, but something along those lines would be helpful for me.
I think that the most recent economic impact analysis for some of these events was done by the Economic Development Department, and I don't know if you've been in contact with them, but maybe as staff we can check in with them and see what some of their recent research showed, and then maybe have that conversation again. I know that the public hearing for this isn't until the 6th, so there's some time to sort of figure out some of that information.
Okay,
so.
that'd be helpful,
Yep.
thank you.
I think it's more Yes, and there's an economic impact consideration for the benefit of the existence of those festivals, but there's so much more than that too for the culture that's created by these events that probably isn't really directly analyzed in that economic impact. And so I hear you, Amy, and I agree that there's probably a conversation on this end as the budgetary authority around achieving the balance between fostering cultural events that are the kind we want to see around here and shifting a real fiscal burden potentially onto residents in order to accommodate their existence.
If I may follow up, I completely agree, and that's one of the concerns I have is losing some of these big events from the heart of the city to go elsewhere. And so but I think at sort of a base level, it would be interesting to see what that economic development or impact would be. And then, of course, I think, and hopefully maybe the Department of Economic Development, we need to be having some conversations there, because they too, part of their goals, as we learned earlier, is to look at how to promote diversity and culture and arts. And so maybe there is a component within that research that they can at least kind of guesstimate for right now of what that loss would mean to this like the heart of the city, right? So, because I completely agree with you, Madam Chair, that it isn't just an economic issue. There's much more to it than that, but maybe some of that economic foundation will help kind of start that conversation as well, or just give me another piece of the puzzle.
Councilmember Kitchen.
I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, but can you tell me which events we'll see an increase of 500 or more? I assume it's a small list.
Have it. I know that the Pride Fest was one. The Farmers Market's another big one. I can't remember off the top of my head any of the more.
Art Festival.
Arts
probably.
Festival is one.
And these fees apply also to Living Traditions?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. All
events.
Those events.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Councilmember Johnston.
I can't recall, what was the fiscal hit to your department by not increasing fees this calendar year for your budget?
Have the number here. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it was, I could get it if you want to bear with me to dig through my.
Okay. Get the neighborhood, kind of north of $1 million?
I
South
don't think
of-
it was that much. It was south of the.
Yeah.
South of the million.
Okay, any other council member while Lance is looking? Questions?
To distract him?
Questions to each other?
That's okay. No,
I
you
have a
won't
question.
distract me.
Actually,
Go ahead, Councilmember.
and I don't want to
Kitchen.
get too deep down this rabbit hole, but it came up earlier in a conversation with Councilmember Fowler when we were talking about this. And since we have Jennifer and Aaron here, the city council took action, I think, in 2015 before I was a part of this body, on 3rd South to create a festival street, right? Didn't we formally decide to shrink
Station
that?
Center.
Yeah, in Station Center. I guess my question is, what was the council's intent to create this festival street? And were we hoping at some point to shift all of our events away from Washington Square and Library Square over to this? Do you recall? I'm just curious what the goal was there, and if you could speak to that at all right now.
From what I recall from the conversations, it was more of an RDA-driven conversation. I don't think it was a council action. It was the RDA adoption of the Station Center area plan. So it's not necessarily a governing document for city policy necessarily. And I think that, in fact, some of the recent budget choices in terms of whether or not to raise, special event fees in the last couple of years have considered more the aspect of wanting to retain activities in the core of downtown rather than, to your point, rather than seeing them go other places. And so I think that was the genesis of the grant funds for these events to apply and defray the costs. But that's certainly a conversation, maybe places where it's less expensive for these events to hold to hold their events. I know that the administration's been in conversation with some of the events about ways to make their event less expensive to put on, you know, that kind of thing.
Thank you for entertaining the question.
Sorry.
Lance, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Did you find a number?
Yeah, so the number's $26,000 is what it would hit the department for. And I also have an answer. Twilight's was the other one I was thinking of.
So $26,000 difference between implementing this and not this year.
Correct.
Is that pretty typical year to year, based on your analysis?
It has been, and that's one of the things when I vetted, when I went through the whole process and see what the impact would be, was try to determine if that was a normal year or if there was an anomaly, either higher or lower than what prior years. But
Okay. Madam Chair, may I make a suggestion?
Please.
It's not binding. For the sake of budgetary clarity, I would hesitate, if we were to sort of do something to help offset the cost of this on a going forward basis going forward, I would hesitate to just waive or do something internally in their budget. I'd like to see the true cost of what they're having to do shown in the budget. If we were to offset it, I'd like to see somewhere else to do it so we could be very clear. And I like the fact that they're trying to be clear in saying this is what it actually costs us to do this service to the city. And then we could find other ways perhaps to mitigate it, but I don't want to confuse it at all within their budget.
And that's actually how the signature, or the ACE fund, the Arts, Culture, and Entertainment Fund, works now. It's actually administered through the mayor's office. I think the budget itself is in the non-departmental budget, but that separation is clear between public services and that fund.
As it comes up, this gets more expensive. I just see us having more questions on sort of case-by-case basis throughout different departments about how do we help offset the cost of what they're doing. And I just want to make sure we're keeping that clear from ways we're helping to mitigate that.
So are you saying, Jennifer, that in response to Councilmember Johnston's request for clarity around the actual costs impacted in or incurred in your division, that one potential resource could be an increase to the ACE fund that applicants could request to basically take care of the fee in an additional way?
Yeah, that's one way to go about it. I think you're going to have the applicants have the same question. I counted on these funds to help offset the cost of my other county fees and my food handlers permit fees and my other fees. And this is one more fee that's sort of adding up to them. But I think that'd be one way to do it that would be very clear in our budgetary cycle. The saying, you can use this for these types of things, even though maybe hopefully we increase that fund so it actually can cover some of the offset. But
Councilmember Wharton?
You said that that was a $26,000 hit. Is that the projected hit for this year, or was that the hit from last year?
that was the hit from last year, but it's
Okay.
projected to be the same. It's going to be close to, depending on,
Okay.
any changes they make, but.
Okay, well, I mean, I do appreciate this. I really understand the sort of the position that you're in, but I would feel a lot better if we could go back and communicate with some of these organizations that have been such a huge asset to our city. I don't really want this to be the straw that breaks their back in terms of relocating. So, thank you.
Okay, I've got some wrap up then. If for you, but also for our staff, that we have heard that we may want to hold off on this one until, it sounds like you've had conversations with those who will be most impacted financially, but that we would like to hear feedback on the potential impact to their operations from this proposed increase. That we.
But I want to clarify, sorry, madam.
Go ahead.
So you want us to give you the numbers, the dollar amounts that impact each one of these organizations? Or are you looking at something more from us?
I think if council members correct me if I'm wrong, that we would like to know what the impact to their operations could be, maybe, what their projected impact is from this proposed increase, and how they might plan to offset that, or...
From this department or for them directly?
Well, it sounds like they've had the conversation, so perhaps Lance has some of those answers and notes from those meetings. It's a small handful of that significant size of events, right? It's like 5 6 events.
Yeah, I also suggest that the big events will get the attention because it's a massive amount of money for them. But I think the smaller events are equally, if not more, impacted because if your budget is $500 and your refuse fee goes up $100, it's a much bigger chunk of your budget, perhaps. So I don't want to leave those kind of smaller ones out that are applying for the support, neighborhood celebrations and the smaller ones.
So Lance, is it appropriate for us to ask you to do an audit-like sampling of some different sized events, projected impacts from the proposed consolidated fee change? Jennifer?
And what I'm hearing, just to add to your question, is not only the financial impact, like this event will have to pay $480 more, but having maybe like a follow-up conversation to say to the event, would that $480 increase cause you to change your event, cause you to relocate your event, cause you to not have your event? Those kinds of more of a conversation as opposed to like the dollar figure.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So we're looking at smallest scale that applies for event permits currently, up to some sampling of the large scale events. Okay, and that I think our decision on this item is going to hinge upon the results of that feedback. Also that we may be looking at considering increase to the ACE fund as a way to make your division whole and also recognize, have more clarity, budget clarity, as Councilmember Johnston said. Okay. Good enough? Thank you, Lance Allen, for being with us for 2 items. We're going to move on to item 11, our Northwest Quadrant and Global Trade Port follow-up. I think, is that the one we're doing now? David Litvak, you want to bring anyone else to the table with you? And Ken Bullock, come on up, grab a mic. Hello, gentlemen.
Madam Chair, how are you?
How's the legislature today?
Refreshing.
Okay, well, that's another item.
So Lynn, I believe, is on his way as well for the next legislative update. And so we're going to just address the Northwest Quadrant. And I'm going to start just by kind of giving a general update from since last Tuesday. And then Ken has a little bit more follow-up as far as a meeting today.
Great.
So as I mentioned at last week's update, last Tuesday, Council Chair and the Mayor, Cindy, myself, and Katie Lewis met with that last Tuesday, Representative Gibson, Senator Stevenson, and Speaker Hughes' staff. He was at the time in D.C. One of the takeaways was a follow-up meeting on Thursday. So we met again last Thursday, the same group. Representative Hughes, Speaker Hughes was in attendance at that last meeting. It continued to be a very positive discussion. I think they responded a bit to some of the ideas that we had put forth, ongoing conversations about land use, taxing authority, and how important and vital those are to the city to maintain city authority and responsibility for those. And there was also some discussion last week about the boundaries of what we're talking about. And if you recall, when the council did the informational, the briefing, Economic Development and RDA presented a map that shows 2 different CRA areas. One, the current CRA, not including the landfill, that has already been initiated and approved, and then the potential of creating a second CRA south of I-80. And there seemed to be some general agreement with the legislature looking at those 2 primary areas as far as what exactly we're talking about with legislation, the Northwest Quadrant. The legislature continues to feel pretty strongly that they want to see some movement, some advancement on governance this session in terms of, and let me say, when I use the term governance, I'm taking for granted right now with this audience that we're talking about where the city has been very clear in terms of the lines on land use authority and taxing authority. And so the legislature would like to see some movement on the idea of a governing body for the Northwest Quadrant, for a global port. And I think we haven't walked away from that idea, but we also continue to emphasize the importance of a business plan in really formulating long-term what a governing entity should and could look like, and the roles and responsibilities of that governing entity. And so what we've discussed from the city is that we could move in that direction of looking at this governing entity, but we also want to recognize that a business plan is an important part of formulating that long-term. So that's kind of where the discussions have continued to be. Council Chair Mendenhall, you were in that meeting. If there's anything else you want to add specifically to last week?
No.
Okay. Pretty high level still. The takeaway last Thursday was that a smaller team from the city and the state would meet this week, particularly the drafting attorney for the legislature and Katie Lewis and city staff, as well as actually property owners were involved as well today. And Ken can give a kind of a high level overview of what the meeting was this morning, sorry.
Actually, two meetings to give you an update with. First, the meeting this morning was myself and Katie from the city, and then Bob Reese, some of you may be acquainted with, is a drafting attorney with Legislative Research and General Counsel, and then representatives from the private property owners. We discussed and emphasized the points that David was talking about, the critical nature that there is to have a business plan, that we can proceed all we want down the road, but if you don't have a plan, I think we all know that we'll just kind of wander aimlessly in the wilderness here. We went through how you as a city, both the administration and the council, feel strongly about from a planning and zoning authority, from the tax increment, and the logic behind that, and really emphasized a shared vision of what this could be without boundaries, without imposing things on us at this point, that clearly by establishing a body that could put together a business plan that is in collaboration with your zoning requirements, all the work that has been done by the city at this point can be brought into play with that, so that the business community, the legislature, and the city can feel comfortable in the direction that it's going. Katie did a wonderful job outlining the ideas that the city feels strongly about. I would say that they were well received. At this point, it's a little frustrating because you get to a point where you have to hurry up and wait, and they still have to draft the legislation. There's a lot of bills and other types of things that are going on from the appropriations process, but I can speak fairly confidently that we know it'll get done, and there'll still be additional discussions that'll be taking place, but I would say that it was very positive. There's a good tone about this. Senator Jerry Stevenson from the Senate, former mayor in Layton, will be the Senate sponsor of the bill, and not only does he understand your concerns, but I think it's important that he's heard your issues, but there's also a need and a feel that they want to memorialize this and be able to have something that everybody can understand the ground rules. Some of the points that were made that brought up that are details that have to be addressed and can't be addressed later are things, Madam Chair, that you and Cindy have brought up in terms of administrative responsibilities, in terms of proceeding with RFPs and those types of things. So those issues have been addressed, and So I think it's moving in a very positive direction. And I think it's also important to note, as frustrating as the process can be, that Speaker Hughes, Representative Gibson, and Senator Stevenson want the same objectives that the city wants. How we get there oftentimes can get convoluted and we talk past each other, but I'm confident that they genuinely want to be partners with you as much as you want to be partners with them.
Councilmember Kitchen?
Thank you both for joining us today. Any possibility you could speak to more detail on what you expect to be in the bill? Obviously, you haven't read anything, but you mentioned that they want to see a framework this session. So in your mind, if Salt Lake City retains our taxing authority and our land use control, what might the framework, what would the scaffolding of this Inland Port Northwest Quad look like that would work well with us? Can you speak to that a little bit? And I noticed in a couple emails something about an appeals process. Can you speak to that and where our line in the sand might be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where some of that framework will take shape is in terms of the membership of this governing entity. As you saw last week in what we kind of put forth, this idea of a 7-member body that had 3 from the city, 3 from the state, and 1 from the county. And I think that is something that is a part of the conversation going forward in terms of what this governing entity looks like in terms of makeup. I think the formulating the boundaries and the word that Ken used, memorializing what the boundaries are that we're talking about, may be a part. And please understand, I'm kind of speculating a little bit here because we haven't seen a legislative proposal as they are still drafting it. But some of the themes that we're talking about, so the boundaries. The other piece, I think, we have been, again, to purposely sound a little bit like a broken record, we think that this governing entity laying out one of its key tasks needs to be that business plan. And let me be really clear that from both the administration and I won't speak for the council, but I think reflected in the council's remarks as well. When we talk about a business plan, we're not talking about just creating a broad vision for the area. We're talking about something that's very concrete, that lays out, that puts some meat to the bones of what that vision is, but lays out some concrete steps and areas that need to be addressed, and how do we implement or how do we get to that? And so I think you will see some of the possibility of some of that laid out. In the legislation, how much we get into some of the administrative issues is yet to be seen. Specifically, Councilmember Kitchen, on your question about appeal, there has been some discussion about this governing entity having appeal responsibilities when it comes to land use decisions in the Northwest Quadrant. We have discussed what may be a line of comfort for the city that this governing entity could have appeal responsibilities when it comes to administrative land use decisions. We are very jealously protective of the legislative process at the city and don't think that we are comfortable allowing this entity to have appeal responsibilities over the council's land use decisions, but administrative land use decisions may be one of those areas, and that it would be done very much in the same framework as it's done today within the framework of our ordinances. Whereas, as you know, if the Planning Commission makes a decision and it's appealed, we have 3 officers to choose from. Well, maybe that process is mimicked through this appeal responsibility through the governing entity. So we have had those conversations with the legislature around what that could look like. And I will.
Individual appointed by the governing entity,
Yeah,
not
yes,
by
thank
the
you.
governing entity
Right.
themselves.
Individual, because there could be times where there's a conflict there. The other thing I will say that we have discussed internally is this governing entity also having a role in making recommendations to the Planning Commission and to the council when it comes to land use issues, planning and zoning issues, so that this governing entity is recognized as a partner in that way as well.
Councilmember Fowler had a question in there.
Thank you for the update. And, you know, I know that what we all want, I know that the council and the mayor and the administration seem very much to all be on this same page. We've all had our discussions and are moving forward in those discussions with the state. And again, I think that we very much are all in support together. My fear, however, is that the state is going to say, here's our legislation, and it takes away your tax increments, and it takes away your land use, and there we go. Thanks for the conversation. On a scale of 1 to 10, pretty easy speculative answer here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how realistic is my fear?
You're not putting me on the spot, are you?
No, not at all.
No, not
this
at all.
is an easy
Well,
one. It's a softball.
Can I preface this? Have we had this conversation about what my nickname in graduate school was?
No, what's that?
Okay, Pollyanna. So let me just draw that line in the sand. I actually am pretty confident that that's not going to happen. I think echoing what Ken's saying, that there's a shared desire to be partners here, and we continually, from our end, we emphasize it and they emphasize it back. Are there going to be some disagreements along the way? I think so. I mean, I'm not Pollyanna, but not naive. I think that initial draft of the legislation, there may be some points in there that we're going to be negotiating on. But in terms of land use authority and taxing authority, I'm actually feeling pretty good about our ability to maintain that. I think there's a recognition by many at the state that we all play an important role, meaning different levels of government play an important role and have certain responsibilities. And I think what we're asking for is to respect that in maintaining that taxing authority and land use authority, and that actually we can create something stronger by doing so. So right now, I'm actually kind of confident that scenario won't happen, but I will also be the first to admit when I'm wrong.
Councilmember Johnston, then Councilmember Kitchen. And Ken, I'm sorry, Ken's been wanting to pipe up.
Sorry, I talk too much.
No, I just wanted to come back to your original question, Councilmember Kitchen. When you look at the board members, I think there's a clear recognition this is something that is unique of what's being proposed out there. And so you need a set of very definitive type of individuals who have certain skill sets. This is not like just a regular board that, you know, where you're looking to appoint people. So I would anticipate in the legislation that when we talk about a governing structure, the individuals, there'll be certain types of qualifications that they'll want to have. You'll want to have someone with a finance background, or and I'm just speculating, but you know, international marketing, those types of things. So even though we may be talking in broad terms, I think there are some very specific things that both you and the state would expect this governing board, or I shouldn't call it governing board, but this commission to have some very definitive skills.
Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you both for being here. Now, I guess a question quick, Ken. Did you get to your second meeting you want to talk about?
Oh, I had a meeting this afternoon with Senator Jerry Stevenson, where we outlined a lot of the things that Katie and I met with this morning, and it was a very positive meeting. Senator Stevenson is going to be the lead sponsor. It's going to start in the Senate, and I think that's just an important administrative piece of information for you to have, because where the bill starts is critical, and Senator Stevenson, well, all of them engaged, but you know, he has a particular position of authority that allows him to have a lot more influence in how bills can get prioritized. He did emphasize to me that, you know, they want to have a bill, and I think it's very fair that it's something that, as I mentioned earlier, to memorialize discussion so everyone has a real solid understanding of expectations.
Okay. I'm glad they've been positive in tone. I'm glad it sounds like they've been productive to this point. I'm also glad to hear that some of the complexities of private development agreements and current private landowners and that sort of, those issues are being brought into discussion at this point. Just two questions. One was, this morning the discussion was between the attorneys, and I'm assuming that's more technical, but give me a sense of what the purpose of that particular meeting was without the elected officials involved. And then the second one is, what's the next step as we understand it as far as meetings or interaction?
So the intent of this morning's meeting was to begin to lay out that framework and what could be the beginnings of legislation. I think I mentioned, but just to be clear, that the private property owners were a part of this morning's discussion as well. And I know from the city and in the state, they continue to be an important part of the conversation and will be moving forward. The private property owners have stated numerous times publicly and to all of us how pleased they are with the city. And the professionalism of staff and what we're doing and really making way for them to accomplish what they're trying to do. And that has been reflected, I believe, in and helpful in keeping that positive tone. But there was no clear next steps laid out this morning. But I can guarantee you that we will stay on top of it. And that we will be reaching out to Mr. Reese tomorrow or the day after, just as that is being formulated.
Councilmember Kitchen, then Councilmember Wharton.
Sort of related. Well, let me preface this by saying it's been a little bit clunky to have all these different governmental organizations try to work together to hammer out this new idea, or this big idea, I should say. And so I think I just want to acknowledge that I'm really proud of the administration and council and state leadership as well. I think that we've worked really well together. And I think Operation Rio Grande really did set the groundwork for a really productive dialogue between the city and the state. So I'm really thrilled with that. But I did receive an interesting phone call from the press today that raised a question about the airport, and I had no idea what they were talking about. So do you have any information on if there's anything in the works at the legislature with regard to the airport and how this ties into the Northwest Quad and the global trade area, if it's worth speaking about right now? Or
Sure. We are we don't think there is anything currently being discussed at the legislature regarding state takeover of the airport. There was legislation that came out this weekend, I believe, Senate Bill 200, Senator Harper, that transfers some of the responsibilities under the tax commission having to do with, I'm not even going to tell you because I'll get it wrong, some of the responsibilities of the that the tax commission has with the airport and valuing airplanes and things like that, and moving that under the Department of Transportation. Our team has reviewed that. Our airport team has reviewed that and is not opposed to that. Doesn't involve us. That is the only piece of legislation right now or that we're aware of and that we're anticipating having to do with the airport. We have, in the conversations, and good conversations, I think there's a general understanding about the importance right now, timing-wise, in discussions of the airport with the bond and how that could be impacted. Plus, Bill Wyatt had an opportunity, along with Delta executives and the mayor, to meet with key legislators a couple of weeks ago just to talk about the project and the brand new airport that's being built, and those were extremely positive and well received. And so we're not seeing anything, and we don't anticipate anything.
Councilmember Wharton.
So, I guess my concern is that you're saying that there's a shared desire to work together, Pollyanna and Ken.
And Ken.
And Ken. But then I hear these, that there are also these conversations, or we get these calls from media saying that the city's stalling, that it's our fault that there isn't text yet. And so it's hard for me to gauge where we really are at. So I guess that would be sort of my frustration today. So when will text be released? I mean, there's a do or die date, right? When is that?
March 8th. I will say first, can I make a snide remark about the media not get printed? Just kidding. I'm just teasing. What I would say to all council members, and whether it's about this particular issue, Operation Rio Grande, or anything involving the legislature, that if you're hearing things and you have questions about it, please never hesitate to reach out to myself, Ken, or Lynn. There's always a lot of chatter, a lot of rumors that happen during the legislative session, and sometimes it's unintentional, sometimes it may be a little intentional, but we also want to make sure that we're being very responsive to you and can answer your questions. So if you ever have that fear again, or angst, please reach out to us. In terms of the timeline on the drafting of the legislation, that really rests right now with the legislature and the drafting attorney, Mr. Reese. We feel, and we will continue to be very responsive and engaged, and by no means are we holding anything back to try and slowly kill perceived legislation.
I know that, but isn't there by the legislature's rules, isn't there a date that things need to be written and published, or no?
No.
Okay.
I mean, some of the deadlines, there was a deadline for numbering of bills.
Okay. Maybe that's what I'm thinking
Bill
of.
files, which have already passed, and there's a deadline. Every piece of legislation must have at least one hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And so at some point during the legislative session, committee hearings will cease. And so that's kind of a deadline, but committee hearings can be scheduled along with 24 hours notice. Ken?
To your point, to what David was just saying, there's these very famous words that you get used to up there, and it's called under suspension of the rules. So when you make the rules, you interpret the rules, you set your own rules. And there's been instances where long into the session they've assigned a bill and had a committee hearing that day to accommodate that. So they'll follow their rules. It's just sometimes it can be a little fluid.
And let me also just clearly say that I don't think that, I know from our end, I can speak very confidently from our end, that we're not playing games. We're not, and I don't feel like the legislature is either. They have engaged some of the community organizations. There is a town hall this Saturday. Senator Escamilla and Representative Holland, and from my understanding, Speaker Hughes and Representative Gibson
Senator Stevenson
will be there to engage the community in this conversation. which to me, I see that as a sign of partnership and really engaging.
Okay. Well, I'm still having that fear and anxiety, so you'll probably be hearing from me more.
I will watch for the call.
All right, thank you.
There's a certain healthy amount of that with
Yes.
any legislative session, though, right?
Absolutely.
Ken, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you. I can appreciate all of the anxiousness that the city has, but as I've said to many of the legislative members of leadership, this is a great opportunity to have a paradigm shift in the relationships between the Capitol and the legislature, and being able to demonstrate that you can solve big problems. And there's a healthy amount of friction that goes into this and frustration. They're not overly familiar with your attention to details. I love that. I quote you all the time now, Madam Chair, about the city is good with details, and that's a body up there that has a lot of ideas, and being able to collaborate those two is critical. And the outcome is important, but I think equally as important as the outcome is the process in which you guys have collectively come together with them, and it's something to build on. So, yeah, is it nerve-wracking? But there's a lot at stake on both ends, and both of them want to get it right. So
That's a good segue to wrapping this up, which I haven't said anything in this discussion today, but I recognize the fear and the concern of my peers, and that our purpose for this today was both to brief the public and hear from you all as a whole body. But this is a ongoing conversation, and while I probably am the opposite of your Pollyanna title, generally speaking, I am feeling very optimistic about the collaboration that we have been experiencing with the state. And we, unlike the state, who meets 45 days a year with some interim sessions during the months in between, we are here almost every single week, and our staff is here every single day, 5 days a week. So there is a capacity for bringing a lot to the balance of the conversation there with two very different calendared bodies even. And I think the city is fulfilling its role in that capacity very well, and the state is appreciative to some extent that we're still in the conversation. So with that, thank you both for giving us this update. David, if we could keep you at the table. Ken Bullock, thank you very much for your expertise and time. And could we invite Lynn Pace up here for item 12 on our agenda, our state legislative update, except for the Northwest Quadrant. How you doing, Lynn?
Fine.
Good.
Good evening.
Good.
Nice to be with you. Yeah, if we're not talking about the Northwest Quadrant, gee, is there anything else going on up there? I'm just kidding. It's just, there's actually lots of other things going on up there. Madam Chair, do you want me to proceed with what I think you'll be interested in, or do you want to
Yes.
bring up the issues that you're concerned about first?
Council members, do you want to steer this, or you want Lynn to? All right, Lynn.
Okay.
Shut you down if you think we're interested in something that we're
Well,
not.
the reason I say that is because I debate every week what to tell you about in that update that I send out, which in this case was just yesterday. So there are a couple of things that I would bring to your attention. The first is the bill that all of legislative leadership has talked about as the homelessness funding bill, and there's not been a lot further discussion about what that means, except to say that they wanted to have a bill that brought more money into the equation. As that dialogue has evolved, it's become pretty apparent that there are two proposals out there. One of those, neither of these bills have been released yet, so this is just discussion, but one of those would be a bill that would assess or collect funds from cities to help fund the operations of the homeless resource centers. So that would either go to Shelter the Homeless or the Road Home, or to Division of Workforce Services, then to be apportioned out. But most importantly, that would be money that would not go to the host communities. So Salt Lake City would not receive any of that money. That's proposal number one. Proposal number two is a similar bill that, again, would assess funds from all of the cities around the state, but those funds would be pooled and would be available to host communities to defray the costs incurred by those communities in hosting those shelters. The rationale behind both of these bills is that homelessness is, while homelessness is a statewide concern, the burden of providing the resources falls disproportionately on a certain narrow range of communities that host those facilities, Salt Lake City being one of those. And so, as the speaker has said more than once, if any city had the choice, they would probably prefer to write a check rather than to take the privilege of hosting the shelter in their community. And so he's trying to by legislation, create a vision that where every community has some stake in the ongoing dialogue on providing homeless services, either by hosting a shelter or by helping to fund the communities that do. But those are two very different models. There are more details than that in terms of how it's funded, which cities contribute, which cities would be eligible to receive funding, the mechanism providing that funding, whether it's a sales tax model or a property tax model. But if you have a policy direction on which of those two bills you would like us to pursue, that would be welcome, because that's going to start moving very quickly.
Councilmember Johnston?
And excuse me for stating some things. These actually are trying to address two different issues, though. They sound very similar, and it's getting confused sometimes, but the one issue is just the offsetting police, fire, infrastructure problems that you may incur by hosting two of these in Salt Lake City and South Salt Lake, hosting it, particularly South Salt Lake and smaller communities where they don't have the internal resources in their city, period, to do this. So getting that from other cities to offset those costs is one issue, just infrastructure issues, right? The second one is something that I'm worried about, funding operations in these facilities. And so the other bill he talked about was about assessing some amount of money from other cities to actually pay operating costs. That's people running these facilities, those kind of things. So they address two different issues, and both of them are very important. However, they are very different in the fact that the one would go directly to a city, cities paying a city. The other one would be cities paying into a fund, either by DWS, a state entity, or a private nonprofit, like Shelter of the Homeless. And from my hearing conversations in some meetings, that's a big issue for folks, the difference between those two. I just don't want to confuse that they're trying to address two very different problems and issues in front of us. So, and for Salt Lake City, frankly, in both cases, we would receive, theoretically, support. One would be direct to offset costs. The other one would be for providers who are providing the services in two locations to do the service there, which could impact our city life, really. How well they do those services has a big impact on the community, right? So,
I should point out that the projected or the target dollar figure for each of those bills is roughly the same, about $3.5 million. So people who have said to me, well, why don't we do both? And we could, but that would virtually double the cost. So.
And these are two separate sponsors?
Two separate sponsors, correct.
Republican or Democrat?
Both, one of each.
Oh.
One of them is focused primarily on providing funds to those communities, notably Midvale and South Salt Lake, who received the pleasure of hosting a shelter forced upon them by the state, and their limited resources for providing those facilities. So Gene Davis is sponsoring the bill that would provide a funding mechanism to cities. Now, hopefully that pool of revenue would be large enough that it would be more than is necessary to help South Salt Lake and Midvale, so it would also be available for grants for other communities like Ogden, Salt Lake, St. George, or others who would be hosting facilities. The second bill, sponsored by Representative Elison, is focused more on providing funds for the cost of operating the facilities. And so they're very different models. The numbers are about the same, but both bills look to assess to all of the cities those costs.
And do we know the mechanism?
There have been two mechanisms discussed. One is taking that amount off the top of the sales tax before it is distributed to local communities, because sales tax is collected by the state, and so they could take those costs off the top before the funds are dispersed. The other model that has been discussed is something that would involve property tax, where there would be an assessment made, and if payment hasn't been made by the date property taxes are dispersed, those funds would then be redirected to the state in the appropriate amount.
And are those two separate models aligned with the two separate proposals?
Correct. So actually, right now, both of them are talking about using the sales tax as the mechanism for collecting those funds, because that's the easiest mechanism for the state. The League of Cities and Towns, has been reluctant to have the state start reaching into our sales tax dollars, and so they've been exploring other models. I don't know if that other model will come to fruition or not, but there's been dialogue about that possibility.
Madam Chair, if I could just make a comment about those two pieces of legislation as well. The Representative Elison's bill, or it's not drafted yet, so the conversation of funding of this funding source to fund the resource centers or operations of the resource centers is a new piece of the conversation. When this issue first came up last year, and Representative Elison ran legislation, it was to provide the funding to the cities for mitigation. There's some conversation about whether or not that funding source for operations, if this is the right source, if that's even needed. Part of the initial $27 million ask was ongoing dollars for operations. And then also, as a part of the plan developed between the city, the county, and the state, was the shifting of resources as the road home, the downtown shelter closes, to the new resource centers. So it's kind of a different dynamic than was there initially last year.
And how does the state currently fund the assistance for the Midvale Family Shelter, where they support the 24-hour police presence? I might be using the wrong words there.
General fund dollars.
Okay.
They have appropriated specifically to Midvale City for a law enforcement presence at the shelter.
Would that be wrapped in? That maybe it's too early.
I'd say it's probably too early, but my guess right now is probably not.
But with the city-to-city dialogue, that money could be used in South Salt Lake or Salt Lake City.
Yes.
Correct. Again, depending on the sponsor, their objectives are different. Senator Davis has been primarily concerned in making sure that those communities that were forced to accept homeless shelters have the adequate resources to provide those. On the other hand, Representative Elison's bill is focused more on making sure the providers have adequate funds to staff and operate these facilities.
Okay, council members, okay, let's keep going.
Okay, the second piece of legislation that I wanted to alert you to is the transportation discussion. As I've mentioned to you before, there's one sort of omnibus transportation bill that is becoming the transportation bill and squeezing out a lot of the others, or all of the other smaller transportation bills are getting wrapped up in that one. The challenge that they're wrestling with is how to fund what they have in mind. Bear in mind that this bill, it's Senate Bill 136, sponsored by Senator Harper. One of the primary objectives is to restructure the Utah Transit Authority and reform the board. That does not appear to be very controversial, and that is sort of settled. What they're wrestling with is another provision of the bill that would open up the State Transportation Infrastructure Fund for transit. So those state transportation funds would be eligible to use on transit projects. In a lot of areas of the state that are not as excited about transit as Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County are, those legislators are concerned that opening up that fund to other projects will dilute the fund and make less money available for the critical road projects. So while they think that's the right way to go, they're concerned about not just increasing the uses for the fund, but increasing the size of the fund. So that discussion has taken two forms. One is a legislative mandate that will say, if those counties that have not yet adopted Prop 1 have not done so by 2022, the state will do it. This legislation will enact Prop 1 in 2022, but instead of the locals keeping the money, the state will keep the money. That will be a significant increase in revenue for Salt Lake and Utah County. So that's piece number one. And the bill has also been changed so that the proposition does not have to go on the ballot. It can be adopted by the county council if the county council is willing to do so. So that's part one of the funding. Then they put in some other miscellaneous pieces: an increase in the transient room tax, an increase in the car rental tax, an increase in electric and hybrid vehicle registration fees, miscellaneous things. There's been a fair amount of friction on those other miscellaneous funding items, enough so that many of those may either be reduced or disappear from the final bill. That has left the legislature still, many legislators, thinking that they need to do more to increase the size of the transportation fund. We, of course, I think would be supportive of that because the needs are certainly significant and growing going forward. But what we have emphasized is to preserve what they have in place, meaning the existing authorization for transit, the 4 quarters that have been authorized, even if those have not been enacted yet. And if they're looking for additional funding to add something to that, I don't know if they will do so. I'm not sure what it would look like if they did, but they are wrestling with allowing for increased requests to be made from the fund without having an increase in funding. So that's one challenge that we're running into on the transportation bill. Another piece that you ought to be aware of is that there's a provision of the bill that would allow for governing entities to use what they're calling value added as a financing mechanism for transportation. That's in essence something that says if we're going to put in a road and thereby increase the value of the adjacent properties, we can collect some portion of the tax increment from the increase in the value of those properties to help fund the road project.
So it's an SAA without anyone saying, yes, we want to.
The mechanisms are not necessarily clear. It's more like an RDA function, where you capture the growth in the value created by the project and you use some portion of that revenue to help fund the
But you're
improvements.
talking about adjacency to the infrastructure improvements.
In some concept, meaning I don't know if it means immediately adjacent to the road or within a certain radius. All of that is in flux. Jennifer?
And just to add, I think the key difference between this and an RDA that we have now would be that the state is sort of the ones to decide what transportation projects would be eligible for that kind of funding.
Well, and this is the reason I was bringing it up, is because the bill at present says that one or more governmental entities can enter into an interlocal agreement to utilize that tax increment value. We need to make sure the bill reflects that one of those governmental entities has to be the city, because we don't want the county and the state agreeing to do an interlocal agreement with our tax increment. So we just need to get that wrinkle taken care of.
Make sure of that for us.
Slight detail. Anyway, we're working on that. We actually think that's a useful tool, but it needs to be crafted so that we're clear as to what the scope is and to who is able to make those decisions for the use of those revenues. Anyway, that's the transportation bill. As I've said, there have been other smaller transportation bills around the periphery, but they've all sort of gotten stalled because this is the main event and they all impact this big bill. The third issue I wanted to bring to your attention is just what's happening on the water bills that you're aware of. There are about 6 water bills. Well, there's probably about a dozen water bills, but 6 that we're really concerned about and monitoring. The most significant of those are 1, House Bill 135, which would restrict Salt Lake City's extraterritorial jurisdiction. That bill was in committee Friday. It was held, and as things are at the legislature, they come back. So tomorrow it's in committee again, and we will be speaking to that bill. Another bill that we are concerned about that has not yet been in committee is a proposed constitutional amendment that would put on the ballot a proposed amendment to the Utah Constitution that would remove the existing prohibition on a city leasing water. Right now there's a constitutional prohibition that won't allow you to lease or sell city water it would remove that one word, leasing, from the Constitution. We're concerned about that because it has lots of unintended consequences that we think need to be studied before we throw that out on the ballot for voters to consider.
Lynn, pause on Bill 2. Charlie, Luke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, tomorrow morning, you mentioned this, that Representative Noel's bill is coming back, but so is Representative Coleman's. Both seem to be resurrected after having been held on Friday evening. So have you had a chance to look at the second substitute on Noel's bill?
Yes.
And
the bill essentially takes the extraterritorial jurisdiction of cities of the first class, which is currently Ridgeland, and reduces it to the same as is used by every other city in the state, and that is 300 feet on either side of the stream and a certain radius upstream from a wellhead.
Okay. And I can't remember if it was that bill or Coleman's bill that ended up dying because it tied?
It was Representative Coleman's bill that was held on a tie vote.
Well, yeah, okay. So have you seen the changes in that one? Or what are they
Representative
using to
Coleman
bring
has
that
not
back?
made any changes to her bill. She's
She's
just
not.
bringing back the same bill for reconsideration.
Okay. Do you still anticipate that we'll have the same support to oppose those bills?
Yes, but as council members, you know, things don't really die at the legislature. It's kind of like the Princess Bride; they're just nearly dead, and they can come back at any given point. But so I think the same parties still have the same positions on these bills, but I think what will. So I don't think there's been any dramatic change in position.
Okay.
And we'll see where the vote goes tomorrow. As I mentioned, the bills we are most concerned about are Representative Noel's bill and Representative Stratton's proposed constitutional amendment. Among the other bills that we're concerned about, one would be Representative Coleman's bill. We have been attempting to amend that bill in a way that would be acceptable to us. She's refused that. That dialogue is continuing. There's another bill, House Bill 303, on water sizing requirements. It seems like there's one dealing with Utah Lake, and we just want to make sure that bill is drafted so that it protects existing water rights in our exchange agreements. There's another bill on canal relocation, but that bill has been negotiated.
Is that Senator Hinkins?
Senator Hinkins'
okay, so
bill.
that one's up tomorrow
that one
too.
Is,
but you've been working with him.
We
on
have amended that bill to our satisfaction, so we support that bill.
Okay.
But that bill is a good example of what we're after, and that is that bill was raised last session, lots of unanswered questions. It went through a year of interim study, and we were able to bring that back with all parties on board, and it became a consensus bill. We really think that's the model for good water legislation, but I understand sponsors would like to get their bills passed now, and so
that's
we're
one
having
of
a dialogue.
6.
Yes.
The canal bill,
Thank
but
you.
we've got the Utah Lake, HB 303, constitutional amendment, HB 135.
And HB 124. And HB 136 is the bill that was dealing with federal designation. That would have affected the Central Wasatch Commission and Mountain Accord, would have required us to get permission of the legislature before seeking federal designation. We got that bill amended so that the bill now only requires us to, at some point, consult with the the Legislative Natural Resources Committee. And so that bill has been negotiated to a point to where it's acceptable to us, and it actually passed the House today. So,
Good work.
So,
There's just 4 or 5 others now.
yeah, well, there's probably every year there's about a dozen bills. Half of those are housekeeping in some fashion, but these
some big
5 or
ones
6
this
are
year.
substantive
Yeah.
bills that need to be carefully evaluated.
Councilmember Luke, you good?
Can I make one clarifying? Sorry, Lynn.
It's okay.
House Bill 136, as Lynn mentioned, passed. I think it's fair to say that we still don't like it, but in the realm of where it started and where it is today, it's much different. I think it's fair to say that it's still, if you look at the Mountain Accord process and the Central Wasatch Commission and what that entity did in coming up with asking for that federal land designation and all the local stakeholders that were a part of it, including local legislators. I think we still feel that House Bill 136 is still little bit of overreach. It's not nearly as bad as what it was, and if you have to go and consult and get feedback, fine. But it's much more acceptable than where it started, but I still don't think we are overjoyed with it.
True.
Thank you for your editorial, David.
One thing I should mention, although I will note that Councilmember Rogers is not present, he asked to be alerted if there were any billboard bills. What would a session be without a billboard bill? We do have some billboard legislation, House Bill 361. The bill in its present form is awful. We're working on it, and we have committed to work with the stakeholders to see if we can identify a fair process that can be incorporated in the code. We've given them our proposal. They're considering that.
What's the nutshell?
Well, the issue is there have been a couple of lawsuits that Salt Lake City had relative to decisions we made to purchase billboards rather than to allow them to relocate. Those lawsuits have played out in court, and so we got court rulings based upon the existing statute. I will just note that the city prevailed on all counts. The billboard industry was not pleased with the results, and so they would like to change the statutory framework accordingly. And it is true that the process by which you make a decision to purchase a billboard and how you go about arriving at a fair value is not clear. So to that extent, if we can agree on a process that could be put into the code, that would probably be a good result.
As long as the process still allows us to acquire billboards and take them down.
Correct. It would not change our authority it would preserve our authority to purchase. It would just detail the process by which we negotiate a value or by which we end up in court to argue over that issue.
Shall we wrap up?
Madam Chair, may I ask?
Councilmember Johnston, please
On
do.
Representative Elison's bill about funding the resource centers, we haven't seen the bill yet, but the idea about funding it was partially based on doing it based on how much a city was implementing its moderate affordable housing plans. Is that still what's being discussed, as you heard?
That is one possibility. And,
Okay.
and so just to get a little bit more into detail, on Representative Elison's bill, they were going to raise about $3.5 million to fund the operations. That amount, the 3.5, would be assessed to cities across the state. The cities that host one of the facilities would be exempt, and then the amount that you would be charged would depend in part on the amount of affordable housing you have in your community. What that really amounts to is it was intended to be to encourage people to encourage the building of more affordable housing. One of the challenges we've run into as you get into that is that once you start carving out exemptions, it's much harder to administer the tax, for one thing. And second, every year you'd have to recalculate the formula, because if City X builds more affordable housing, then next year, City Y's portion of the bill goes up. And so it'd be very difficult to have any predictability as to how much your bill was going to be, because it depends on what everybody else does in the next year. The other challenge is that there was some talk about giving credit for not just the amount of affordable housing that exists, but also your efforts, like CDBG money or money in your RDA funds that was dedicated toward housing projects. Once you started calculating in all of those credits, you got less and less cities paying the bill, and so the amount those remaining cities were paying kept going up. And so I think there's some significant challenges with trying to merge the funding of the resource centers and an incentive for affordable housing. I suspect that those may need to be segregated out and dealt with separately, just because you run into a lot of unanticipated challenges.
And the second affordable housing question was Representative Coleman's bill about changing CRAs and taking out the economic development piece, but leaving in the 10% requirement for affordable housing. Is that not proceeding at this point?
No, we thought the bill was gone, but it was back on the agenda today for a committee this morning. They did not get to it, but she clearly intends to continue to pursue the bill. We oppose that for the reason that we think it's important for every city to participate in creating affordable housing, and that affordable housing should be dispersed throughout the county, not just concentrated in the urban core. So we are opposed to the bill, but it appears that she intends to pursue it.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll wrap it up with that. Thank you.
Thank you,
Lynn
and
Pace
I will
and
reiterate what David
Litvak.
and Ken said, and that is if you have questions in between or you hear things, please don't hesitate to call or email us, and we'll be happy to respond.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank
Thank you.
Have a great time up there, and we'll see you next Tuesday to hear more. We've got 3 board appointments. I think you're all here. Are you, Holly? Great. We're a couple minutes early, but our first is, actually, I think all 3 of them are here. So first, we will ask Holly Nichols to join us at a microphone. Pick your mic, any mic will do. And this is for an appointment to the Sugar House Park Authority Board. Holly, thanks for joining us. If you wouldn't mind, give us a little introduction to yourself, maybe your background that applies to this and your interest in serving on this board.
Sure. So,
But come right up to that mic so all our TV viewers at home can hear you.
great. Holly Nichols. I live in Sugar House, about a block away from the park. I have a background in architecture and construction from Seattle originally. Graduated during the recession, so ended up getting my MBA in kind of process work. Ended up coming out to Salt Lake to ski, so been doing a lot of that lately. I wanted to be a part of the board, one, because I use the park a lot. I'm in it almost every day. There's a lot going on in there, and I felt a little bit of an obligation to give back to it. 2, I have a lot of background in development, and I read kind of the 9-year plan, and I found a lot of places where I think I can be really helpful with my construction and architecture background. And then 3rd, I am a millennial, and I think there's a lot of ways that the park is not doing a great job in letting its community know what's going on. So I'm hoping to be helpful in that way and kind of spreading to the greater community through social media, or the website needs some work in those kind of ways.
Great. Thank you, Holly. Council members, any questions? Yes, Councilmember Kitchen, please.
Hi, Holly.
Hi.
Thanks for your interest in serving on this board. You mentioned something about millennials not knowing what's going on in the park. Can you give us a couple examples of things that you'd like to highlight and how you might go about doing that?
Sure. So one of the places that I had a really hard time getting information was when the park was going to be dredged. So I went to the website, I went on Facebook, there's an Instagram, and because that's where I go for information, and there was nothing. There's a new playground going in April, and we were talking, they were like, yeah, let's have a big opening celebration. And it was like, how are you going to tell people that that's happening? And currently there's not a really good resource. I think the Facebook page has 191 people who like it, but there's more people than that on the playground at any time. So, and even just the number of 5Ks every weekend, if there was a way that living a block away from the park, that I could know when they're going on so that I could join them or avoid the park, would be really great.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Ms. Nichols, for being willing to volunteer and give back to the great big park that is Sugar House and a part of your neighborhood. We don't require you to stay. We'll go through the approval process in our formal meeting, and generally people can just go home after this part of it. So we thank you for being willing to serve.
Madam Chair, you can go home, but you can watch it online, so.
I was warned.
Thank you, Holly. All right, we're on to item 14, where we get to invite Mayor Jim Riding up from West Jordan City and consider his appointment to the Airport Advisory Board. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Would you mind giving us a similar, we know you're the mayor of West Jordan, but some background and your interest in serving here?
Well, I've been the mayor all of about 5 weeks now, so.
How's the fire hose?
I am still getting my feet wet, clear up to here. My background, I worked for the city of West Jordan for 15 years prior to running for mayor. had to obviously resign my position, which I could have retired if I didn't get elected, which would have been fine too. But because I worked there for 15 years and had the opportunity to be over streets, parks, facilities, cemeteries, solid waste, those kinds of things at the city, I understood the city. And so I wanted to run to see if I could help. And part of that was obviously being on this board. I'm looking forward to doing that. I want to see what I can do for the city to be able to let the board know what the city's needs are regarding the South Valley Regional Airport, as we refer to as Airport Number 2 down there in our city. And we're grateful to have that. And so grateful to have a slot on the board. Personally, to myself, I'm married with 7 plus 1 kids, 24 plus 5 grandkids. I have an undergraduate degree in management and a master's in business administration degree. So I'm looking forward to doing what I can to serve on the board as well and to serve the city of West Jordan as their mayor.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Questions from council members? It's that easy, Mayor, sometimes. It's so much easier than getting elected. Huh?
Yeah, I would do this anytime rather than do that
Well,
again.
we'll probably just ask you to show up to the airport authority boards instead of having to come back here with us. But just as I said to Ms. Nichols, you need not stay. We do our official approval in our formal meeting after 7 o'clock, but we appreciate you coming to introduce yourself and speak with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, we will move on to our final board appointment consideration for the Transportation Advisory Board. David Alderman, come on up. I think you were the first one here, and I'm sorry you're the last one on our consideration.
No problem. You're actually a little ahead of schedule, so that's great.
Tell us all about you.
My wife and I moved here to Salt Lake City about 6 years ago after I retired from working in the oil and gas industry. I don't have a background in transportation, any special expertise, but I do have an engineering degree. My background's been engineering and then operations management. But after moving to Salt Lake City, got involved with our Avenues Community Council. And I served as the chair in 2016. I've been on the board for about 5 years now. And after my time as chair was up, I started looking for other opportunities to volunteer, something else that might be available. And this opening was coming up just at the right time, and it's something I'm kind of interested in, and I think that the transportation is an area where it's a lot of opportunity there for both kind of small scale issues and also larger ones that are impact us. So looking forward to working on that group.
All right, council members. Councilmember Kitchen.
Thanks for your interest in serving, Mr. Alderman. So this is an important board for our city, especially as we grow. We're looking to add twice as many residents to the valley in the next couple decades, and we are seeing explosive growth. Can you talk to me and the body here a little bit more about your philosophy on transportation and how you can tie in multimodal transportation into the city as we grow? Because not everybody can continue to drive single occupant vehicles, right? So if you could talk to me a little bit more about your long-term philosophy for the city.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, the intermodal, the different opportunities we've got is going to be a key. One of the challenges is some of these things aren't necessarily city controlled. So you've got UTA, you've got UDOT, you've got other entities that are also part of this. But I think the city has to try to make a vision, I guess, for all of those groups to work together on that. It's kind of an interesting thing because if you ask people what's the biggest problem in Salt Lake City, traffic is probably not going to be the first thing that gets mentioned by a lot of people, unlike a lot of cities where it's number one on the list. But as you mentioned with the growth, it could be, if we keep growing like this and we don't do something to slow the use of everybody bringing their own car, it will be an issue.
Councilmember Wharton.
Dave.
Chris?
So how do you think that your background in engineering or as an engineer, what kind of skills can you bring to bear for the Transportation Advisory Board?
obviously, I'm not going to do any engineering. And in fact, it's been a long time since I actually practiced as an engineer. But I think the problem solving, being able to work together with a group, a lot of my career was also spent working internationally, where you get a lot of diverse opinions and conflicting priorities that you have to work through. And I think that sort of thing is good for this group. I also think my time with the community council and working through with the neighborhood and also some of the other contacts with other community councils is good, because part of the role, as I understand it, is also to educate and promote. And I think that's a good tie back into the neighborhood, back to the community.
Well, I'll chime in on the heels of Councilmember Kitchen's comment and question that this is very important and actually a fluid place right now for transportation in our city, as this body is looking at the possibility of implementing portions of our transit master plan, which I hope you'll familiarize yourself with, and also looking at addressing some decades-long infrastructure needs, sidewalk to sidewalk. And the utilization of our Complete Streets ordinance in those discussions, I think I can say, is of utmost importance to this body, that we are always considering all modes of transportation when we're addressing a roadway, especially for a reconstruction. Did you want to jump back in, or you just?
Oh,
okay.
I'm excited you're talking about this.
And I'm disappointed you're not going to be an engineer on the board, because
I'm sure there are much better engineers on staff already.
there's a lot of opportunity we've learned from conferences we go to, and learning from what other cities are implementing to use sensors and build smart streets, essentially, within the infrastructure investments there. So if you have any, if you're reading the same articles we are, then I hope you bring that kind of feedback to those conversations.
I think it's also interesting in the, this term, the first self-driving cars will be ready to be available and coming into town. And
yes,
how that comes in, how they're accepted, not just technically, but how they are used by people and how they fit in. It's also going to be important.
All right, sounds like you're ready.
Thank you.
And you too may go home or wherever you intend to go next. You don't need to stick around for the formal
All right,
meeting.
thank you.
Thank
very
you for your
much.
willingness to serve our city.
Thank you.
Okay, we're on to our last item. I see Liz Bueller back there, but it's really just Jennifer Bruno and council members. That's our budget discussion follow-up. Jennifer, do you want to say anything?
Just briefly, I think we listed this knowing that it would be sort of open-ended, not knowing how the best mechanism to follow up from last week's discussion on all the many funding needs that are out there and the different kinds of funding sources that are out there. And I think staff is at the point where maybe we could use some direction from the council in terms of what you want us specifically to kind of go forward and look at in terms of funding sources, and then we'd come back to you with information once we get some more information.
Thank you. And I can also, I think I can say that on the 6th, we'll be looking at process. Can you say some,
Yeah,
give us some more context?
On the 6th, we will hear from the Finance Department and the City Attorney's Office about a little bit more about the mechanics of a sales tax, or of the sales tax option that's on the table, especially as it relates to the timing of when you might make that decision, and then when the money will start flowing. That affects the total amount of money, obviously. And I think the question now of, or if you guys want to exercise that option of how far out are we looking at in terms of that decision? So,
Because it's quite a delayed process to begin to collect the revenue after the decision is formally made.
right, it's somewhere between 4 and 6 months, and that's what we hope to get some more clarification from the administration. So
the idea that we could adopt a sales tax option, which we haven't made a definitive, right, but that we're starting to move around positively in the discussion here, that we could adopt a sales tax option in time for it to basically begin collecting revenue at the fiscal year 18-19 transition, that window's basically closed already. That we're already looking, when we consider the need for public process and for us to hear from our residents about this option, we're looking at best case scenario, I'm hearing late fall for collecting. So we're already really cutting that potential 33 million annual revenue down a lot for the next year. So my question for us today is whether or not we'd like to instruct our staff to begin working with the administration on some thoughts of how to come back to us with a public process proposal should we want to move this sales tax option ahead. Councilmember Luke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think at this point, the longer we wait to decide something, we're not gaining anything in waiting. What I would like to do, though, is have staff move forward on both options. Now, whether we as a council end up deciding to move forward, that can be decided later on. But I think at this point, just so that we're not wasting any time at all, I think the direction ought to be that we move forward on the sales tax option. That doesn't hinder the public process. It doesn't bind us to actually moving forward with it. But I think I would rather have everything, all the I's dotted and the T's crossed before we start having the discussion about what the money's going to go to, because I think, as far as, whether or not we choose to move forward, that is going to have to be a big part of it. We're going to have to know how that money is going to be spent. I don't think we necessarily need to know what every, specific project is that the money would be spent on, but we have to have a pretty clear idea as to what we're going to, if it's going to be infrastructure related, if it's going to be a mix of infrastructure and public safety. Those are some of the things that I think we're going to have to figure out very, very soon in order to have a transparent public process. So I would say let's move forward immediately on getting everything done so that when we are ready to make that decision, we can do so.
Councilmember Fowler, but let me just reiterate, thank you for bringing up both of the options, because the general obligation bond option is really time sensitive. And I completely agree that critical to our decision is going to be our public process feedback that we get. And so to delay receiving public feedback is cutting ourselves off at the knees.
Yeah, and I think the process will be different for both the GO bond and the sales tax, because the GO bond will, it's a voter approved bond. So there will be
the implementation
that opportunity.
process.
The implementation process, though, I think is important. The sales tax, though, we have to be really, really careful on and really direct on, because the public will not have the same opportunity to weigh in, through a direct vote that they will with the GO bond. So I think the more clear we can be, the better. But we have to start doing that immediately.
And am I hearing you right? I hope I am. That we might be asking for a straw poll in a second to ask our staff to work with the administration on advancing the public process for both options, because of the time-sensitive nature. That it doesn't make sense for us to just do one and then a month later do the other one.
And after, once we move forward, we may not decide to implement either, but if there is a chance that we're going to do it, I think having staff get everything in order now is critical on both.
Councilmember Fowler.
Madam Chair, it was like you read my mind, because I was going to suggest that we do a straw poll on having staff move forward with the public process. And that's just because, member, Madam Chair, you probably want to hear from other people that may have some ideas, but I agree with Councilmember Luke that we should at least get this party started. So, thanks, Chris. So, at the end, I'm happy to
You'll put our
suggest a
straw poll? Okay. Anybody else? Councilmember Johnston?
I agree. What would be our time frame for talking about specific allocation of this?
Jennifer?
I think that it might be premature to answer that question because I kind of see a little bit of a chicken and an egg, and maybe this is where we would look to the administration and the civic engagement people for their expertise on engagement, because I think there's two ways to approach it. You could ask people what they think the money should be spent on and what they hope to see with the city funding, and then make your decisions based on that input. Or you could say, here are our needs and here's our way to fund it, and then just ask people what they think about that, right? So, but I think that it's maybe a little premature to answer that question, and I think that that's where having some clarity from you guys about, are we at the point where we definitely want to try to answer those questions, keep working on the public process. We could report back to you guys either at the 6th or whatever the meeting after the 6th is, I can't remember. 20th, with a plan, maybe what that might look like.
The reason I say that is because I don't want to go into the process saying, here's more money, let's figure out what to do with it. I want to go in saying, here's the need, therefore this is the revenue we need to do this. It sounds like it's an arbitrary thing, but I know internally each of us has had these discussions already and saying, this is what the need are, this is what the money is we need, but for the public, I don't like backing into it saying, let's go get more money and figure out how to spend it. And so that's where I'm sort of figuring out from a body perspective, we need to sort of be very clear about why we're pursuing more funding rather than just for its sake.
And we can provide that feedback. I think they're in the room listening, and so I think that's really helpful feedback for them to have in terms of what your goal is.
Our priorities are pretty clear too. So Councilmember Wharton and then Councilmember Luke.
Yeah, I want to just emphasize what I was trying to think of Councilmember Johnston just previously said, Andrew said, and I think that going into it and saying, what would you like to see us spend this money on is the absolute wrong thing to do. The whole reason why we're having this discussion is because we're in a funding, potential emergency if we don't do anything. So I think that we have to go at it from that angle and presenting the needs and saying, this is where we have to be. How would you like to see us get there, public?
Councilmember Luke?
Yep. The quickest way to lose any sort of GeoBond election or support for a tax increase is by not articulating exactly what it's going to go towards. And again, I think that we can avoid talking about specific projects and street, giving addresses about where the projects will go. But I think it is our responsibility to make the case to the public as to why we believe that we have to move forward with something. Articulate what the issues are that need to be addressed, and then ask the public how they would like us to go about doing that. But to Councilmember Wharton's point, just leave it. Creating an open-ended process isn't realistic, and it immediately has the potential of setting a false sense of what people are going to be getting from this, which will irritate everybody.
Okay, so I'm hearing that we're about to have a straw poll around, but let me just reiterate the other bits and then we'll wrap up with the straw poll perhaps. That we want to clearly articulate the needs But I wanted to get a little bit more clear in there because at our last budget discussion where Mary Beth presented the near $16 million structural gap that the administration will be looking at as they make their budget proposal for this year, that about 10 million of that is normal. That we see that basically every year. And that there's a portion of that that is from our 50 new officers, that's public safety related, that's not part of the 10 million. And so I want to be clear that for me, I'm not looking to raise revenue to fill what is a normal structural gap that the administration normally deals with and solves for. And what I am looking to solve for is our priorities of transit, streets, public safety, and potentially affordable housing, and that those are the only items that I'm interested in us talking about here. So, but we will all get into what those items are. Right now, I think a general clarity is what we want to begin our public process with, and we have some dollar sense of what that would take to talk to the public with. Anything else that okay, Councilmember Fowler?
I would propose a straw poll based on what Madam Chairperson Mendenhall just stated in the clarity that we need to move our public process forward.
So maybe to request that staff work with the administration to...
That staff work with the administration to get that clarity and provide more information to the council probably sooner rather than later.
on public process.
And on public process, yep.
Clear?
Does that make sense to everyone?
Kitchen?
Without modifying that poll, I think that it's also important that we identify some of the administration's goals with these new dollars that we would be playing with, just to see. You laid out 4, I think, priority areas.
Actually, they're kind of based on the mayor's state of the city
Well, there you go.
and our own priority session
Yeah.
that was within
I
that
think we
month.
all heard that from the mayor. I guess what I'm asking is just some clarity that those are shared objectives with, yeah.
Great. Okay. Council members, I don't think I need to roll call this one. All those in favor of that straw poll? And that's unanimous with Council Member Rogers absent. Public process begins. Anything else on the budget discussion? If not, we will call this meeting concluded and see you. Well, we're going to do our announcements right now. There's only one?
It means you'll end earlier later. Let's see. The Hibernian Society, the St. Patrick's Day Parade, is going to be on March 17th from 10 to noon. They're asking if council members want to participate. We're coordinating with the fire department to see if it's possible for council members to ride on one of their fire trucks as the council's done in years past. It's pretty cool. So let the front office know ASAP if you're interested in participating in the parade, if you're available.
Are
then we can
families
plan.
invited?
They have been in the past, and we can just confirm that for this. Are you interested as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let staff know.
Any dogs?
That's a good question. We'll ask. There are a lot of dogs walking in the parade. She has short legs, though.
Riding.
We'll ask about families, fur, and human.
Okay, we will wrap this meeting up and see you across the hall at 7 o'clock for our formal meeting. Thank you.